After knocking on the door, the doctor and nurse opened it, and the doctor apologized for disturbing them but said he needed to examine the patient. The young man, who was washing his face at that moment, looked at the specialist in surprise but did not respond. A few minutes later, the doctor was not only examining his new patient, but also removing his bandages. The surprised doctor told the nurse that he simply could not believe what was happening, as nothing like this had ever happened in his extensive practice. The man said that the boy had lost consciousness and was in critical condition as a result of a traffic accident, but had almost completely recovered. It looked as if the boy had been healed by holy magic. The patient thought to himself that this was because his body had actually been healed by holy magic, and that this process was triggered automatically. But our hero did not remember any accident. The frightened young man immediately asked the doctor if his magical power had really been depleted, hearing that the specialist did not understand what he was talking about. After that, the young man began to talk about how he clearly remembered fighting dangerous monsters during the disaster. Realizing that the patient might not be himself, the doctor decided to ask the boy his name and what year it was now. With confidence in his voice, the hero stated that his name was Ichikami Minato and that it was now 1970. Asking if he was right, but realizing that there could be no mistake, the doctor immediately declared that this was post-traumatic stress disorder, or more precisely, memory damage. After that, the specialist calmly explained that the boy's name was Kusanagi Minato, and that it was now 2022. Now the young man understood nothing, so he looked closely at the people in the ward. For a moment, a strange doubt crept into our hero's mind, but then he decided that these people had no reason to deceive him. A moment later, the patient turned his gaze to the TV, and the guy noted to himself that now the object had become so thin and the image so clear that it was as if the person was sitting right next to him. A moment later, Minato Kusagi looked at the calendar, which also said that it was the end of 2022. However, what surprised the young man most was not this, but the device held by the nurse, which was an ordinary tablet used everywhere in the hospital. Finally, it dawned on the young man that this was no joke, and that he had somehow ended up in the future. Minato Kusanagi saw that the doctor was gesturing with his hand for some reason, and immediately began to say that the disaster mentioned by the patient had happened 50 years ago, but it had not been repeated since then. Responding to the young man's question about why nothing had happened again, since there were monsters, the doctor explained that there were monsters, but there were few of them, and now it was a time of peace. Our hero thought to himself that if this was really true, then they had managed to achieve lasting peace, and with relief, he thought that this was truly a great blessing, and therefore there was no need to worry about many things anymore. However, Ichami Minato is dead. It happened during the Great Disaster 50 years ago. This man sacrificed himself to save the world, and therefore the boy cannot be this man. The doctor said that many people know this story, and people never stop telling it to others. The patient was silent, but he thought to himself that he had died at that time and then reincarnated as Minato Kusanagi. But it was unclear what the point of this was. A few weeks later, our hero walked confidently into a house. Looking around carefully, the young man realized that one of the rooms belonged to Kusagi, or rather, to him, because they were now one person. Looking at the photo, the young man noted that this boy's parents had died when he was still a child. After that, Minato Kusagani was sent to a children's home, where he lived for some time. But he did not stay there long because he was adopted, although his adoptive parents kicked him out and sent him to a boarding school. The documents also stated that after graduation, the young man moved into an apartment, which he pays for with money and inheritance left by his biological parents. Falling onto the bed, our hero told himself that the magic of reincarnation did not exist. This meant that his reincarnation was the work of some higher power, although it was quite possible that it was just a coincidence. Picking up his student ID, the guy realized that he was studying at a magic academy, which was strange because in his time such institutions were not needed. Smiling, the young man anticipated something truly interesting, realizing that he would be able to learn a lot for himself. But a moment later, our hero was distracted by a phone call to the device in his pocket. Kusanagi Minato saw that Tadao-kun was calling him, but he had no idea who this person was. But the main problem was not that, but the fact that the guy had no idea how to use this strange thing, which he hadn't even had time to learn more about. So he decided that the best solution would be to just take the phone and throw it as far away as possible, so it wouldn't get in the way. A few minutes later, the call was actually over, but now another signal followed, notifying him that a message had arrived. It said that since the guy had been discharged from the hospital anyway, he should come to school. Realizing that a new life was beginning, Minato Kusanagi knew that he had to live up to his image, because there would be no other life anyway. walking slowly across the schoolyard. The teenager thought that this was the very Academy of Magic, Kamui. The young man happily told himself that going to school as an adult was so interesting and entertaining. But a moment later, the young man became pensive, as if something was troubling him greatly. This concern arose when our hero was watching the students practicing something in the courtyard. Watching the kids train on mannequins, Minato Kusanagi thought, puzzled, that something was wrong with magic at this time. The teenager was convinced that magic was something internal, something mysterious. But now it seemed to him that it was definitely not about power. At the same time, the students, paying no attention to anyone, did what they always did at this institution. It didn't matter to them what magic used to be like. They knew what was happening now, and therefore had to practice. Having seen various techniques, our hero clutched his head in horror and thought to himself why it was all such a disappointing and dreary story that literally drove him into depression. The young man convinced himself that it was all untrue, that it simply couldn't be true, that the power of all these people was barely a tenth of that of the beginners of his time. And so it seemed to the teenager that all these students would never succeed in magic at all, and he became even more upset because it was like being intoxicated by reality. Upon entering the classroom, our hero realized that magic had greatly weakened over the past 50 years, although he still decided not to jump to conclusions. Sitting down at his desk, the young man wanted to know if he had any friends in this class, or at least those who treated him well. Suddenly, everyone in the classroom gasped, although the reason for this was unclear. At that moment, 3 guys entered the room, one of whom, clearly referring to our hero, began to insult him, saying that he had not even bothered to reply to his message. Slowly turning around, the guy tried to figure out who was in front of him. Surprised, Tadao-kun looked closely at the student, who seemed to be saying something incredible. Lifting his leg and wanting to kick the teenager, the young man shouted at him, asking how he dared to forget Tadao, which was a great disrespect. After that, the ill-wisher began to call our hero a worthless piece of trash. Unexpectedly, Kusanagi Minato began to smile naively, saying that he remembered the person standing in front of him and adding that he had met his friend. Reaching out his hand, the student also noted that he was glad to be recognized and hinted that the guy definitely knew how real friends should behave. Shaking hands with his detractor, with the same naivety, our hero continued to say that being friends means getting along in the best possible way. Irritably pulling his hand away, Tadao-kun shouted that this was not what he meant at all, and, starting to shake the student, he declared that he had run out of money, so the guy had to hurry up and give him his money, adding that he had a lot left from his parents. The teenager was silent, but he understood to himself that the young man whose body he was in had been bullied in his past life. Swinging his arm, Tadao-kun shouted irritably at the student not to be stupid. But at that moment, a girl entered the classroom and politely greeted everyone present. The stranger's face beamed with a smile, and there was no trace of anger or any other emotion on her face. At that moment, it seemed as if life had first burst into new colors, and then stopped. The young people in the classroom looked closely at their classmate as if they were seeing her for the first time. This was also the case with Tadao-kun, who was now looking not at the young man he had been teasing, but at the beautiful girl. Pointing his finger at Kusagami Minato, the ill-wisher said that they would return to this topic later, but that he shouldn't relax because he would regret it. Our hero watched this man closely, thinking to himself that he looked more like a clown. After a while, the lesson began. Writing something on the board, the teacher explained that they would be discussing the great disaster that happened 50 years ago. After that, the teacher began to tell how monsters began to appear all over the world, and humanity fell into despair. But the great sage Ichikami Minato, the pioneer of magic, thought completely differently. He did not give up and defeated all the monsters himself. Finally, this man faced the boss of the disaster, the Lord of Demons, whom he defeated by sacrificing his own life. Since then, the disaster has never returned. When asked about this hero, the teacher saw Mizuha's hand raised and said that she could answer the question. She immediately happily explained that this hero was the only survivor of the first disaster and the first magician. In addition, the reason why the Kamui Academy of Magic was built was because this man was a world hero and the idol of every magician. The teacher confirmed that this man was the first survivor of the disaster and the first person to use magic, and that the academy was created to produce true magicians like this leader, adding that Ichikami was the greatest magician. While the teacher noted that this question would be on the test, our hero sat and felt embarrassed, thinking to himself that he no longer wanted to hear about what he was like in his past life. The young man did not expect to be tormented by this old story, and felt that he should not have come to this school. However, everything was as the doctor had said. Peace had indeed reigned on the planet, which was perhaps why magic had become less important and less in demand. Looking out the window, the boy wondered if this was really the case. Then where would real powerful magicians come from? On the other hand, the young man felt a sense of calm, probably because he had been reborn and didn't need to worry about anything. At the end of the lesson, the teacher said that they had covered everything they needed to, so the students could leave, adding that tomorrow they would be tested on their magical powers. Approaching his classmate, Tadao-kun began to mock our hero again, saying that during the assessment of their powers, everyone would see how worthless he was. But the young man didn't care. He wanted this stupid detractor to shut up, so he decided it was time to leave. And when Kusanagi Minato had almost left the classroom, he heard a remark that his parents did not possess magical powers. A second later, all the kids started laughing at the fact that the young man was an orphan, and therefore had never really had a family. Unwilling to tolerate such treatment, our hero turned sharply and called out his abuser. Hearing this, the bully immediately clenched his fist and yelled that the boy was taking too many liberties and would be brought down to earth immediately. Suddenly, the office was flooded with a bright stream of light coming from the opponent. It was clear that he was going to use magic. Some of the kids standing nearby begged him not to do anything like that, saying that it was better not to do such things in class. But Tadao-kun did not hear this and did not want to listen. He was focused on his opponent and shouted that he would not live after such words. But the trick was that the guy didn't care at all. He stood there with his bag slung over his shoulder and continued to do so, as if there was no one in front of him. Mizuha, fearing that something bad would happen, immediately ran towards the young people. As she got closer, the beauty shouted that he shouldn't do it, that it was a big mistake. But Kusanagi Minato, as before, did not care at all. On the contrary, he was curious to see what would happen next. A moment later, everyone gathered there noticed a bright stream of fire. It seemed as if something had exploded ahead. With anger in her voice, the girl shouted that her classmate had no right to use magic against a person with whom there had been a minor misunderstanding. She added that someone could get hurt because of this stupidity, and that magic was not created for this purpose, but should be used for good deeds. But with insolence in his voice, Tadao-kun declared that it was not his fault, that all responsibility lay with the other guy. Everyone gathered watched intently for the clouds of smoke behind which Kusanagi Minato was supposed to be. The guys didn't know what they would see, but in a moment the outline of a young man appeared. Our hero was still standing in the same place, silent, seemingly lost in thought. Mizuha, surprised like the others, watched her acquaintance closely. He in turn said that he had been hit and scratched his head. Tadano-kun was in complete shock. He could barely utter how this kid was in such perfect condition after being hit point blank with magic. How was that even possible? Our hero thought to himself that he didn't need to actively use magic because he could easily defend himself from first-level magic with a simple magic barrier. After that, he stated aloud in an icy tone that he was only tolerating this because he was dealing with an ordinary child who didn't quite understand what to do, and in a more threatening voice, he continued to say that despite this, the student still had to be punished. Fear and other mixed feelings could be seen in the eyes of his detractors, but despite this, they continued to stand in their places. Suddenly, the space around Minato Kusagani began to sparkle with a bluish tint, and something changed in his gaze. After that, everyone present saw a bright glow that filled almost the entire room. The guys tried to understand what was happening, surprised that for some reason they couldn't move. Mizuha, who was a smart girl, understood that this was a higher level of magic than she had seen before, but she still couldn't understand what had happened to her acquaintance, nor how he knew about such techniques. Meanwhile, the young man walked confidently toward his offender, the one who, for the first time since they had met, was truly trembling with fear. Suddenly, the young man stretched out his arm, but remained completely silent, which made it even more frightening. Tadano-kun watched his opponent, unable to utter a word, but understanding that he was doomed after everything he had said and done. At that moment, the teacher's thunderous voice rang out in the classroom, asking who dared to use magic in class. The man looked at our hero and continued to say that he was waiting for an explanation. Sighing heavily, Minato Kusagami remained silent. It seemed that he did not want to tell the truth, but he was not used to lying either. However, after a moment, he began to smile and say that nothing interesting was happening in class, adding that it was quite possible that the students had decided to do something interesting outside. Hearing that no such classes were held outside, our hero continued to stick to his story, explaining that some student had probably used magic at their own discretion, adding that wizards like to play around with magic. It was difficult for the teacher to believe this because there was smoke in the classroom. But the student explained that he had also been outside, so the teacher gave up, saying that since Kusagani had stated this, he had no reason to doubt it. However, he immediately jumped up from his seat and started shouting that he was still going to find the culprit. And until he did, the students should sit down in their seats. Waving his hand at the teacher, the young man decided that it would be necessary to create false evidence so that the teacher would never get to the bottom of the truth. Mizuha remained silent, but she looked at her classmate suspiciously. He sensed her gaze, but didn't feel the need to turn around and explain anything, if only because he hadn't done anything wrong. His rival was also annoyed and watched the guy intently, but he remained silent as well. Kusanagi Minato decided that he would not pursue the subject today because he had other important things to do. After a while, the young man was walking down the corridor, noting to himself that he should go and see the city with his own eyes. Old Shibuya looked as frightening as possible because the damaged buildings had not been demolished or repaired, and power lines were strewn everywhere. The young man realized that he wanted to understand many things, so he used magic to quickly fly through the air to where he wanted to go. Finally, the young man landed on some kind of crossbar. Looking ahead, the guy thought wistfully about how much Shibuya had changed since he was last here. But he didn't want to waste any time, so Kusagi Minato sped up and headed somewhere ahead. Staring into the distance, the guy realized that he didn't sense any monsters in these places. Everything was in ruins, although it was clear that the police had evacuated everyone from this place. However, a moment later, the young man admitted to himself that he could sense the aura of monsters, albeit quite far away. Sitting down, our hero decided that now he could also sense some kind of human presence. The young man was not used to just waiting, so he decided that he needed to go to the source of the signal to check everything thoroughly. And this was justified, because nearby, cornered, sat a woman who was desperately screaming at the monsters not to dare approach her. However, the monster did not listen to anyone. It opened its mouth as wide as possible and began to growl as loudly as it could. Kusanagi Minato immediately landed on the ground so that the woman was behind him. Ranker could clearly see the beast snarling and growling, getting closer with every passing second, but he was not afraid. However, only a couple of minutes passed, and the guy, with his hands in his pockets, looked intently at the monster he could easily defeat. Despite this, the young man was in no hurry to do anything else. He was just waiting for something. The tearful woman was doing the same thing, still sitting pressed against the wall, trying to understand who had just saved her. At that moment, the boy's attention was drawn to a badge attached to the woman's shirt. He thought that she was a representative of the magical police. The teenager did not bother to clarify this. Turning around, he simply told the blonde woman to be as careful as possible. As he sped away and was about to leave, the young man heard the girl say words of gratitude to him. The guy was already far away, but despite this, the policewoman was still muttering words of gratitude under her breath. The blonde didn't know who this man was, but she told herself that only great magicians were capable of such things. On the road, the young man was glad that he had hidden his face, because our hero had just transformed, and he didn't want to stand out and arouse suspicion. However, Minato Kusanagi was frightened by the fact that such a low-level monster could kill this woman, which meant that the level of magic in the police force had fallen to its lowest point. It turned out that people in the modern world were completely incapable of defeating monsters, and not only students, but also the police. Only the word mage remained. The young man understood that this era was certainly characterized by advanced technology, but it could not be said that people had gone too far in their development. Smiling, the teenager said that even in this era, the inhabitants of this city needed his strength and his knowledge. Our hero decided that he needed to destroy all the monsters in the area so that they could no longer harm anyone. Standing next to some kind of device, the teacher said that in today's class they would measure the magical power of all students. It is very important to obtain both the sum and the attribute, as these are the most important indicators for those who want to become professional magicians. Looking at the device with horror, our hero wondered if there was any other way to measure his own power. The boy was depressed by the fact that even the teachers did not know so many basic things, and yet magical perception is the basis of magic. And while the young man sat with his head in his hands, Mizuha approached him and asked if she could talk to him about something. His classmates who were watching this scene seemed unable to believe their eyes that such a thing was even possible. Looking closely at the young man, the girl said that this seemed to be their first conversation, and then announced that she was the second daughter of the noble Mizuha magical family, and her name was Yuika. Our hero looked at the beauty in surprise, unable to believe that magicians had somehow acquired a noble lineage. The beauty began to get upset that the guy didn't know such things, and noted that it was one of the 4 main noble houses that ruled the magicians. The young man remembered that in his time there had never been any aristocrats, and there was no need for them at all. Moreover, he had never heard of a family with such a surname. Looking at this girl, Minato Kusanagi decided for himself that, despite everything, this student's level was very low. Considering that his classmate came from a family of outstanding magicians, her power should be several times stronger, at the very least. A moment later, Mizuha Yuika became angry. She didn't understand what was going on with this guy. The girl was offended because she had so generously started a conversation with her classmate, but he seemed to ignore her. Tadano-kun was also angry, but the reason was that the noble girl from their school was talking to him. Scratching his head, our hero asked in confusion what business the magical nobility had with him, which again angered his classmate. And while the girl tried to control her emotions, convincing herself that she was a noblewoman, the young man did not understand what was happening to her. But in a moment, the beauty's thoughts were already on what had happened the day before, when this teenager had been struck by magic and he hadn't even reacted to it, which was impossible. Finally, the girl began to say that she was interested in yesterday, but did not finish her sentence because the teacher asked the remaining students to go into the classroom. Laughing, Minato Kusagani shouted that it was time to measure themselves. Now, Mizuha Yuika was smiling, and she thought to herself that now it would become clear who was capable of what. Standing in the office, Tadao-kun happily announced that it was his turn, which made him indescribably happy. The young man confidently approached a device and quickly placed his hand on it. The system immediately notified the student that his strength was at 1000 and his attribute was fire, which greatly pleased his detractor, who shouted that he was stronger than ever. Our hero thought that it seemed that the measurement standard had not changed at all in the last 50 years. Next to be tested was Mizuha Yuika, who walked proudly to the device, showing that she was a valuable person and her results would be the same. The girl carefully raised her hand to the device, but did so very slowly, as if she were in no hurry. In this case, the system also noted that her magical power was at 2000 and her magical attribute was water. Our hero's rival was delighted that he and the girl had the highest scores this year, which meant that they could claim the title of best and most outstanding students. Hearing these words, the girl looked closely at the young man, but her gaze showed complete indifference. Meanwhile, their classmates cheerfully discussed their acquaintances, noting that their strength was truly enviable. Only Minato Kusagani thought to himself that these were the worst results possible. In his day, even beginners did not score below 2000 points. Looking at the surprised face of the guy, the conceited Mizuha Yuika was sure that her classmate was jealous, even though she knew that was the true power of their family home. The girl was convinced that she was the best, and therefore he should not look at her so arrogantly. At that moment, the teacher interrupted the boy's thoughts and suggested that the young man test his strength. Immediately, his classmates began to talk about how he was the weakest student in the class, and therefore did not understand what he was doing at their school. Tadano-kun waited impatiently for this moment, confident that this guy would embarrass himself in front of everyone. The girl also looked at the young man smugly, like everyone else, confident that no one would be able to beat her score. For a while, our hero stood and looked closely at the device, not daring to take the next step. The reason was that the young man had no idea what to do, because at one time he stood out among the rest, but now he didn't really want to be the center of attention. The guy decided that it would probably be better to hold back his power a little so that it wouldn't happen again. But a moment later, the young man decided to put his hand on the device after all. After that, incredible things began to happen, because a multicolored glow appeared around our hero. A moment later, the light became so bright and colorful that it literally blinded everyone present. Smiling, Minato Kusagani changed his mind. He thought that if it would help measure his great power as a sage, then it was time to show who was who. The students watched everything that was happening. They couldn't believe that such a thing was even possible, so they stood rooted to the spot. The most surprising thing was that the energy emanating from the young man spread far beyond the test hall. It seemed that there was not a single person who did not feel this power. For the first time ever, Mizuha Yuika became nervous, realizing that this was not at all what she had expected. With each passing second, the pillar of light became clearer and stronger, so much so that it shot far upward. The atmosphere heated up as the energy flow literally swept away everything in its path. The students were afraid that they would be carried away somewhere, so they covered their faces with their hands, frightened by the unknown, and the fact that what was happening was something completely unusual. One of the boys, who was standing closest, backed away, even though he realized that it wouldn't help. Only Kusagami Minato was disappointed by what had happened. The boy understood that the device had broken after he had become a little more serious. The young man understood that none of those present had been able to feel the truly magical power, and therefore doubts crept in as to whether there were any magicians in this world at all, or those who could become them. The frightened teacher began to ask about the condition of the students and whether anyone was injured, but he heard that everyone was fine. Approaching our hero, the teacher asked about his condition, but the young man sadly noted that nothing had happened to him, even though he had been at the epicenter. Looking at the destroyed device, the teacher said that this was the first time he had seen this device break, and therefore assumed that there was some kind of defect in it. He added that there was nothing good about this, because now no one would be able to find out either the young man's magical power or his attribute. The young man did not understand what the problem was, but the teacher explained that they simply wanted to divide the students into several groups for magic lessons. Looking at Tadao-kun, the teacher asked if they would accept our hero into their team. He looked around in surprise and clenched his fist, clearly plotting something. Then he smiled and said that there should be no problem with that at all, since everyone was studying at the same institution. Hearing this, the teacher was delighted, realizing that there would be no problems. Approaching Kusanagi Minato, the ill-wisher whispered in his ear that they would meet on the same field very soon. Arriving in Old Shibuya, the teacher said that monsters still inhabited the areas that had been severely damaged during the Great Disaster. Currently, Shibuya is abandoned, so the only people in the area are mages and a special police squad who are exterminating the monsters that live there. In addition, the academy students must help with this, as more than half of the monsters have already been destroyed by professional magicians, so there is no need to worry too much about it. Standing on the sidelines, Minato Kusanagi thought that the practical training was interesting, since even students should be able to destroy monsters. After all these guys will be working in groups anyway. Looking around, the guy remembered that he had been on this very street last night. The day before, the young man thought he had destroyed all of them, but now it seemed to him that some were still here. Our hero also found it strange that he saw no signs of disaster in this particular area, except that people had been evacuated from here. Yet despite this, monsters continued to come to these parts. Hearing the conversation of the girls who had decided to compete with each other, the teenager thought that they were behaving too carelessly, not understanding the real danger they were in. That's why the young man sighed heavily and closed his eyes. He didn't like this whole idea. Raising his hand, the leader announced that the practical part of the lesson was about to begin, and therefore all students must work in groups to help each other. At that moment, Minato Kusagani, who had moved a little further away, heard someone calling him. The guy behaved as usual, so he walked over to an abandoned building and leaned against it. The guys who were going to make fun of our hero said that no one would bother them in this place. Beginning to use his magic, the ill-wisher noted that last time he had been too soft and kind, but now everything would be completely different. Hearing this, Minato Kusanagi calmly stated that if someone didn't like him, they could just ignore him. Clenching his fist, Tadao-kun shouted that no one would listen to such trash talk. Moreover, the offender couldn't understand why the strongest girl in the class had started talking to the boy. The young man looked at the red-haired boy in surprise, but did not rush to answer him. But a moment later, our hero smiled brightly and declared that the reason was that his classmate liked Mizuha Yuika. The classmate literally turned red with anger and contorted his face into a hideous grimace. But the teenager didn't care about that. His thoughts were occupied with something else, and he didn't want to fight at all. However, his rival was offended, so he put his hand forward and immediately started shouting that the scumbag had only himself to blame for everything. Hearing our hero tell his opponent not to do that, the villain shouted that it was too late to apologize. But the young man told Tadao-kun to turn around, even though he continued to stand his ground, declaring that he would not fall for such childish tricks. However, a moment later, the guy decided to glance out of the corner of his eye to see what was so interesting happening behind him. For a second, the opponents froze, not expecting to see such a large and terrifying monster. The three boys immediately shouted in unison that this was simply impossible, as there were no such monsters in these parts. And while the students were trying to figure out why they had encountered this terrifying monster, it stared at them intently and grinned. The frightened friends frantically asked their leader and comrade if he could defeat this monster, and heard him point to himself and say that it was no problem at all. Turning around immediately, the young man began to use his power, confident that he would quickly deal with the villain. From the outside, it really seemed that the power of fire was so strong that it would be enough to forget about the problem. And a minute later, wiping his face, a smug Tadao-kun boasted to his companions that the job was done. The defeated monster was indeed lying on the ground, but it looked somehow suspicious. A second later, the guy who had been bragging so loudly noticed this himself, saying how could it be that he hadn't even managed to scratch this formidable guard. Standing behind him, our hero thought that a demonic soldier could not be destroyed by such low-level magic. At that moment, everyone present saw the monster get up, and it did so very quickly. Cringing and closing their eyes, the friends tried to figure out what to do and how to act in this situation, but nothing came to mind. The most frightening thing was Tadao Kuno, who was sitting on the floor watching the monster approach him. In a moment, the shadow of the huge enemy loomed over the students, who trembled with fear more and more with each passing minute. The ill-wisher who had been bullying our hero began to cry and tell everyone that they would die right there. It seemed that every second was torture. Also because the young people did nothing to try to defend themselves. At that moment, the monster was closest to the red-haired student, who continued to sit on the ground. The monster knew that he was much stronger than this student, and therefore felt free, knowing that he would remain unpunished anyway. Kusanagi Minato watched the events unfold closely, but he was in no hurry to intervene. Moreover, the guy watched it all with a kind of calmness and even indifference, as if it didn't concern him at all. Only a second had passed, and the creature was already accelerating and about to jump on the boys. Suddenly our hero, who had been standing behind them all this time, now headed towards the monster, passing by his offenders. The guy calmly stated that it was obvious that even a demonic soldier could tell which of them was stronger, and it was clear that the young man knew what he was talking about, because the monster paused for a moment to look at his new opponent. However, Kusagami Minato stood and looked at his current opponent as if he knew for sure that he would deal with him, and very quickly. But the villain was in no hurry to give up, realizing that he too could show what he was capable of. Suddenly, our hero raised his hand and put up a defense for himself, and he was also going to strike the monster. The frightened boys cried and said that Kusanagi Minato would not be able to defeat this monster with his first-level magic, and again, said that they would all die. The young man didn't care what anyone thought of him, so he decided to use the second level, which included the crushing stone. The force of the blow was incredible, but despite this, the young man felt confident, knowing that he could easily deal with this beast. After just a few seconds, the guy was smiling as if he had gone for a walk, not fought a high-level villain. Realizing that it was time to finish the fight, our hero decided that the best option in this case was to use a fire arrow. The firepower was so powerful that the enemy could barely stand on his feet. But despite this, he was still standing. But suddenly, everyone present noticed a bright flash of light, reminiscent of an explosion. The attackers closed their eyes to see what had happened. What happened was that the young men were looking at a huge fire in front of them, which was actually the remains of the monster that had been boasting just a moment ago. Tadano-kun looked at it all in fear, and wondered how this could have happened, how this boy managed to destroy the demon soldier so quickly. The young man understood that this was simply impossible. This was not the guy they all knew. Moving along the road, our hero thought that, unlike his opponents, his first-level magic was capable of doing the most incredible things. But the young man was not interested in that, but in how the demon soldier ended up in Shibuya. Yesterday he killed all the monsters in the area, but they reappeared, and that was extremely suspicious. Our hero thought that it was quite possible that this was a sign of disaster, and therefore the situation was more serious than he had expected. The most unpleasant thoughts began to swarm in the guy's head, thoughts he had already seen in his past life. The young man remembered how scary it was when children sat next to their dead parents and cried, and no one cared about them. The teenager did not want all this to happen again, especially considering the magicians who were there at the time. That's why Minato Kusanagi clenched his fist tightly, but stood rooted to the spot. Looking up at the sky, the boy thought that if disaster struck again, he would definitely save everyone. He promised himself that this would be the case. But in a moment, the young man had to snap out of his thoughts, because his detractors said with some irritation in their voices that he couldn't defeat this soldier. The leader of these guys immediately went up to the wall and hit it with all his might. Gritting his teeth, he thought that something indescribable had happened, and in fact, this situation had disgraced him. However, there was another twist to this story, which was that Mizuha Yuika was standing around the corner, listening intently to the young people's conversation. When the teacher told the student to do his assignments, the girl also went to a certain square to fight monsters there. Her classmates, with whom she was on the same team, stood behind her and were just happy that the student was doing so well. Closing her eyes, the beauty thought about how it was possible to be surprised at her level. Because if you try hard, anyone can achieve similar results. Although, on the other hand, she was pleased that everyone noticed her talent. She always liked to be first. Having dealt with this opponent, Mizuha Yuika turned her attention to the guys standing in some alley. She saw a red-haired guy talking loudly, standing opposite our hero. The beauty had some not-so-nice thoughts when she saw this scene, so she told her friends that she would be gone for just a few minutes. Mizuha Yuika understood that her classmates were leading Kusanagi Minato somewhere off to the side in order to beat him up, but she couldn't allow that to happen. That is why the girl followed them and hid so as not to give herself away prematurely. But a moment later, the beauty looked ahead in surprise, as if she had seen something unusual. Pressing herself against the wall, the student noted to herself that the devil's guardian had appeared to the boys, which in principle could not be. But that wasn't the problem. The student understood that her classmates would not be able to defeat this monster because it had a high rank. And since that was the case, she had to act. Especially since she belonged to the Mizua clan, and therefore could not stand by and watch indifferently. Running out of her hiding place, the girl wanted to shout at the young people to get out of the monster's way and run. But she didn't have time to do so, because at that very moment, a bright, fiery flash of light illuminated everything around her. Mizuhara Yuika was stunned. Not only did she not understand what was happening, she couldn't even see clearly because the fire was burning and the light was literally blinding her. The girl was only able to look around when hundreds of tiny lights were already scattered on the ground. Then she realized that not all the students had fought the monster, but only the one who had always been considered the weakest and even feeble. The student thought to herself that this boy had always been timid and had no magical abilities whatsoever. But now she had the impression that he was a completely different person. Moreover, the student did not hear the young man recite a spell, but what was strange was not that, but the fact that this guy was not afraid at all. The girl remembered that a monster's level of power was determined by the number of crystals it possessed, which also determined its place in the hierarchy. Everyone knows that magical beasts are in 6th place. In 5th place are magical guards, which is what she had seen in front of her a couple of minutes ago. Demons occupied 4th place, supreme demons were in 3rd, and devils were in 2nd. And the leading 1st place was rightfully occupied by the devil or Satan, as he was often called. Every creature has a fixed number of active ranks, which is something that everyone involved in modern magic should know. In order to defeat the guard, one must have at least the 3rd rank. With the 1st, it is simply impossible. The student saw someone's foot appear in the passageway and hurried to hide again so as not to be noticed. However, a moment later, Mizuha Yuika caught herself thinking that she was hiding, although she did not understand why she was doing so. The student thought that the young man hadn't noticed her, but she didn't know what to do in this situation. Realizing that someone was in the alley, Minato Kusanagi calmly stated that the girl had a pretty good hobby, standing and just peeping. The beauty knew for sure that she couldn't be seen. She had checked several times to make sure she was at a safe distance. In the same indifferent tone, the guy noted that it would be strange if the mage did not pay attention to such a thing. The surprised student looked closely at her acquaintance, but couldn't understand what he was talking about. Closing his eyes, the young man asked with a sense of resignation if she really couldn't feel the magical power that emanated from everyone who practiced such things. Mizuha Yuika remained silent, as before, while the young man headed somewhere ahead. Realizing that her classmate was disappearing from view, the girl wanted to stop him, so she asked him to wait for her. She shouted after him that she wanted to know what it all meant, including what the guy had just said. But to the student's great surprise, when she turned the corner, there was no one there. Our hero stood on the roof of the building and looked down at the girl intently. Taking a deep breath, Minato Kusagani decided that it was all for the best. Looking around, the teenager realized that he had climbed up here for a reason, so he decided to check something. Using his powers of observation, the boy determined that there were no guards anywhere nearby, although there were quite a few magical beasts, seemingly around every corner. Sighing heavily, our hero decided that the other students were unlikely to cope with such a large number of predators, so he decided that he could help them a little. Smiling, the young man knew that he would do this in a special way, so he immediately began to monitor the overall situation. In a moment, Minato Kusanagi had already begun to connect some bright yellow magical circles to himself for help. With each passing minute, the fire burned with increasing intensity, but his concentration was stronger than ever. After that, the young man said that he was going to use magical projectiles, which only 2nd-rank magicians could wield. The effect was stunning. It seemed as if someone had scattered magical threads across the sky, although their purpose was unknown. The kids standing on the platform thought they were seeing meteors, although they didn't understand if they were related to magic. A student who understood that if it was magic, then its power was simply amazing, inspiring both joy and horror at the same time, thought about this too. And while some students discussed magic, others watched as beasts slowly approached them. There were too many of them, and so the students thought they would not be able to cope. Suddenly, one of the predators rushed toward the frightened girl, who immediately closed her eyes. The beast was very close. It grinned, realizing that the strength of these kids was no match for its own, and it felt like it was in charge. But in the next minute, the student saw a bright light that literally engulfed the enemy. Realizing that the beast had been destroyed, the student immediately ran up to his acquaintance and began to ask how she was feeling. Standing on the roof, our hero said aloud that so far he liked everything he had done, and everything was going according to plan. However, a moment later, looking ahead, the young man thought about something that bothered him. Minato Kusagani saw the remains of the predators lying on the ground, all of them skillfully destroyed, and that was exactly what bothered the student. He decided that this time, he might have gone a little too far. Covering his head with his hands, the boy realized that he had destroyed all the monsters that were not only in this part of the city, but everywhere. On the other hand, the student remembered that they had been brought here for a lesson, to complete a practical assignment, although he scolded himself for working at full strength. But in a moment, Kusanagi Minato's attention was again drawn to something interesting, so he jumped off the roof. Looking around carefully, the boy decided that there was no one here, although it was clear that this surprised him a little. Without thinking twice, the teenager decided that this was the best place to land and remain unnoticed. Our hero thought that there was no need to hide his power to the extreme, but if it attracted attention, it would cause inconvenience. Moving towards one of the alleys, the student saw the teacher sitting over one of the destroyed animals, surrounded by students. After thinking for a moment, the teacher said with some apprehension that he had no idea there were so many predators left in this place, adding that the herd had most likely already been destroyed. Looking at one such predator, the man thought to himself that they had been destroyed in one fell swoop, and that this was definitely not the work of a student, but of someone who was well versed in magic. This magic did not use any elements. It was magic without any elements, and there were countless projectiles, all of which the teacher had never seen before. Without this magic, everyone gathered there would have been in great danger. Of course, 2 entities were not a problem, but facing 6 was a completely different level. The students understood this themselves, and therefore, shouting, asked the teacher where such a huge number of these beasts came from in these places, since they had been exterminated long ago. Bowing, the man said he apologized for the inconvenience. The students noted that they had heard that the police were supposed to take care of killing the herd, but the academy had to verify this personally. The teacher had nothing to say in his defense, so he simply apologized for not making sure it was safe before bringing the students here. Suddenly, one girl asked who had managed to destroy all these monsters and save them. Hearing that the man himself did not know, the student said that she would like to thank this person personally. Once again, the teacher thought to himself that it was unlikely to be someone from the police or the official magicians. Perhaps it was a talented outlaw magician. But the fact remained that it was thanks to this unknown person that none of the students had been harmed while completing the task. Our hero, who was standing aside, heard the whole conversation and smiled sincerely. After a while, the students who had free time discussed the recent events among themselves, not believing that such a thing was even possible. However, only Minato Kusanagi stood aside, realizing that no one had been hurt and that he had managed to complete the task on time. But not everyone was so happy. For example, Tadao-kun watched his rival closely and was angry. But in the presence of the students and the teacher, the guys couldn't approach the young man and personally ask him all the questions that were tormenting them. The same was true for Mizuha Yuika, who saw with her own eyes how our hero easily destroyed the guard. Moreover, she was confused by the amount of magic she witnessed. The girl knew for sure that fire element magic had been used, as well as magic without the use of elements. But there were no students who possessed 2 elements. But in a moment, the student began to calm herself down, saying that she was overthinking things, that her classmate could not possibly possess 2 elements, and that the elementless magic must have been used by someone else. Despite this, one fact was indisputable. This young man had definitely defeated the guard, there was no mistake. Therefore, she was very eager to know who this young man really was. Interestingly, this thought also occurred to his detractors, who claimed that the laser-like beams must have been used by Kusanagi. Although some of the young people dismissed this idea, they understood perfectly well that it was the young man who had fought the guard. Turning around, Tadao-kun angrily ordered his friends to be quiet, noting that they were saying some strange things. His friends looked at their classmate in surprise, but decided that it was indeed better to remain silent. A moment later, our hero's enemy shouted again, declaring that this talentless boy couldn't be strong, and that someone must be involved in this matter. Laughing, his acquaintances immediately began to agree, saying that there was indeed something sinister going on. But Tadao-kun, interrupting his colleagues, said that the kid was playing dirty, and if that was the case, then he needed to be exposed so that everyone could see who he really was. After class, Minato Kusagani slowly wandered around the city, but looked around carefully. However, within a minute, a whole crowd of students appeared out of nowhere and surrounded the boy on all sides. Laughing, the detractor said that the smart aleck was probably waiting for them. However, the teenager calmly said that he had once again encountered an annoying group, and added that it would be best for them to spend their time improving their magic skills. Hearing these words, Tadao-kun began to sneer, declaring that no one gave low-class people a say. But our hero did not understand what he was talking about, so he asked again. The opponent shouted that the young man was pretending, that no one would believe he could use high-level magic, and therefore wanted to know what trick the student had used. The young man, in turn, looked closely at this person and did not understand how best to behave in this situation. Sighing, Minato Kusagani realized that there was no point in communicating with this guy, who couldn't hear anyone but himself anyway. The ill-wisher turned away, but a couple of minutes later he told his classmate to come over to him. Standing in front of the guys, he added that he would praise him for not running away out of fear, but staying. Spreading his arms, our hero declared that there was no need to run away at all. But the opponent shouted again, telling the young man not to act so arrogantly and say whatever he wanted. Raising his fist, the villain continued to say that there was no place for magic in a fight, that everything was decided by ordinary force. A moment later, the opponent hit his classmate in the forehead as hard as he could. Seeing this, their friends began to shout that this was exactly what the boy deserved, and so they themselves began to raise their hands. Kusanagi Minato heard the opponent yell that without magic the boy was incapable of anything, that he was small and weak. And raising his voice, he declared that the boy didn't even need to apologize because they were going to finish him off anyway, and very quickly at that. However, our hero didn't care about that. He put up his defenses but silently watched what was happening. He thought to himself that in his case, magic was activated automatically, so his enemies could beat him unconscious, and he wouldn't have a single scratch on him. Time passed, but nothing happened, and the young man was already getting bored watching this. But at that moment he heard a voice asking the crowd what they were doing. The best student in the class saw the guy who had killed the guard that afternoon now sitting on the ground, surrounded on all sides by villains. The beauty did not rush to approach or do anything. She just stood and watched closely what was happening around her. Turning around, Tadao-kun stammered and called out his classmate's name, not expecting her to be there. Trying to make an excuse, the student said that the girl had misunderstood them, because they had simply decided to diversify their leisure time. But Mizuha Yuika shouted loudly, telling them not to lie to her, adding that she was well aware that the young man was being bullied. She immediately added that it was unheard of for students of the Magic Academy to engage in such activities, and then asked if the young people weren't ashamed of themselves. The guys looked intently at their classmate, but they didn't know how to respond to her. Lowering his eyes, Tadao-kun began to blame our hero for everything, saying that if it weren't for this person, he wouldn't have any problems. Reaching out her hand to her acquaintance, the best student in the class said affectionately that they would go on together. The ill-wisher watched closely as the couple held hands and realized that this was not what he had wanted at all. The guy's eyes showed hatred, but at the same time, some kind of sadness. He thought to himself again that when his classmate was discharged from the hospital and returned, everything changed. A moment later, he shouted all his grievances so loudly that it seemed half the city had heard him. Our hero heard it, but he didn't understand why he should stop or turn around. Suddenly, Tadao-kun shouted to his friends to start using their magic, which would wipe this upstart off the face of the earth forever. Turning around, the girl asked her classmate in fear what he was doing and what he wanted to do. The next second, the opponents yelled that the guy wouldn't survive after such a powerful blow. Mizuha Yuika watched this flow of magic with horror, so she told her friend, who was calmly watching, to immediately step aside. The boys stood in their places. They would not have had time to do so, but despite this, fire was approaching them with incredible force. The girl realized that she couldn't do anything to stop it, so she covered her face with her hands and screamed because she couldn't do anything about it. Seeing what they had done, their opponents laughed and said that after this, cheating would definitely not work. However, Tadao-kun's friends didn't like it at all, and they started saying that it wasn't a very good idea, although their leader continued to reassure them that the boy was dead, so there was nothing to worry about. He then added that they had simply used magic outside of school by accident, and it had gotten out of control, and Kusanagi had just happened to be in the way. Suddenly, the gathered crowd heard a voice coming from where the boys had just been standing, saying that their mischief was going too far. Coming closer, the young man added that he didn't attach any importance to all this, because he considered it childish behavior, but then fell silent. Appearing after the dust had settled, Minato Kusanagi declared that the stubborn would be corrected with a club, and in a moment he continued talking about how now was the time to punish disobedient children. The frightened ill-wishers could not believe that after such a large amount of magic, Their classmate was not only alive, but also feeling fine. But our hero didn't care about any of that. He knew what he was going to do, so he raised his hand. In an indifferent tone, he said that not only he had been subjected to magic, but also the girl, who had done nothing at all, and added that the villain had most likely gone blind. The red-haired guy, realizing that retribution would not be long in coming, immediately began to justify himself and claim that the guy and the girl were to blame. Preparing to strike again, the classmate noted that he would continue to use magic until he took Kusagi Minato out of action. A moment later, Kusagi Minato raised his hand and extended one of his fingers forward. After that, the young man began to spin a small energy disc. Seeing this, his opponents began to laugh, saying that it was ridiculous because such a magic circle was incapable of anything. A moment later, Kusagi Minato said that he would use a magic drain. A second later, something inexplicable began to happen. Not only did a yellow glow appear around them, but some kind of tendrils also sprouted from this glow. It was something like a vine that enveloped the villains from head to toe, and they, not understanding what was happening, looked at each other and thought about how to get rid of it. Not only were the young people unable to move because their legs were paralyzed, but they also felt that something more serious was happening. Only a few minutes passed, and the villains were already lying on the ground unconscious. Sitting over one of his detractors, the guy thought that he had only sucked out a little magic, and it had already dried up. But he was glad that it was enough, and hoped that his classmates would think about something after this incident. Continuing to watch the student, Mizuha Yuika tried to understand what kind of magic her acquaintance had used, and more importantly, how something like this could have happened. Realizing that the walk had gone on too long, our hero picked up his bag, thinking that the show was finally over and he could go home. But he couldn't do that, because the girl immediately jumped up and started asking the guy to wait for her. And without waiting for an answer, she immediately began to ask what magic the teenager had used, why it was acting so strangely, but more interestingly, how the guy had become so skilled at magic when he knew almost nothing about it. The beauty screamed even louder about who the young man standing in front of her was. Turning around, Minato Kusagani thought to himself that it would be troublesome to answer all these questions. Closing his eyes, the student said that perhaps his classmate should have said something completely different. Embarrassed, the beauty turned away, but then thanked her acquaintance who had saved her. However, Mizuha Yuika was not going to give up so easily, so she asked the teenager again to answer her questions. Turning around, the beauty realized that the young man had disappeared somewhere, but it happened so quickly that she didn't even notice, so she was as angry as she could be. That same evening, our hero returned to Shibuya, because after his afternoon lesson, he realized that there were many flaws in the defense system. The young man did not want to rush. He needed to look around, so he landed on one of the roofs. The young man closed his eyes, as if trying to listen to what was happening and where. Our hero thought that he had a bad feeling, so he came to investigate. But the monsters that were supposed to have been exterminated during the day had been resurrected, which was extremely strange. If this was only happening in Shibuya, Minato Kusanagi could handle it. But unfortunately, the young man sensed the monster's magic in other places as well. Perhaps the police simply couldn't keep up with it all. Moreover, the level of magicians is not very high. Most people are just ordinary amateurs, and instead of studying, students bullied their classmates using magic. The teenager sadly thought that he alone would not be able to deal with all the monsters living in Japan, although he had no idea how to proceed. It was clear that some action had to be taken right away, at least to clear the surrounding area. Moreover, it was necessary to act cautiously without attracting attention to himself. The young man did not intend to waste any time, so he began to deal with the beasts that were nearby. At that moment, a stranger was walking through the area, talking to himself about how he had drunk too much that evening. The man was so confused about where he was that he didn't even notice the monster standing right behind him. The beast had already opened its mouth to eat the stranger, but he had no idea. Kusanagi Minato realized that the man was in danger, so he immediately took action. Hearing a noise, the passerby decided to turn around to see who was following him. But, finding no one there, he decided that he had simply imagined it all, and that it was because he had not calculated his drinking correctly. Peeking around the corner, our hero was glad that the man was very drunk and practically sleeping on his feet. However, at that moment, a stranger was filming with his phone the glow that appears when Minato Kusagani descends to the ground. The girl was delighted that she had accidentally managed to capture such an amazing video, and to become famous, the beauty decided to upload this video to one of the websites to get as many likes as possible. The next day, all the guys who were involved in the fight were called to the principal's office. The teacher said that students from their academy had used magic outside of school, which was the message that had been received that evening. Therefore, if this was true, the matter could not be ignored. Looking from one student to another, the teacher asked them all to explain what had really happened. Tadano-kun was the first to speak up, pointing his finger at our hero and declaring that their team had nothing to do with it, that it was Kusanagi who started the whole fight, and that the rest were victims. Looking ahead, the guy thought about how this ill-wisher could lie so easily. Of course, it wasn't the most pleasant thing, but such audacity demanded admiration. Looking at the leaders, the young man thought that it would be impossible to remain silent in this case, and therefore, even though he didn't want to, he would still have to say something. And while Kusanagi Minato was gathering his thoughts to say something, the girl shouted to the whole office that everything that had just been said was a lie. Mizuki Yuka's eyes showed confidence, and it was clear that she was not going to back down from her position and her words. The student explained that Tadao and his friends had bullied this guy, and that they were the ones who had started using magic first. Hearing what the student said, the teacher asked her if it was true that our hero had also used magic. Mizuha Yuika had no intention of lying, so she honestly replied that the young man had indeed used magic, but only for self-defense, and he had done nothing wrong. Kusanagi Minato looked at the girl in surprise, seemingly unable to believe what she was saying. So unexpected was it to hear. Suddenly, the opponents began to say something in their defense. But they didn't have time to say more than a few words because the girl immediately shouted for everyone to be quiet. Turning to her classmate, Mizuha Yuika said that it was unthinkable that not only was the boy mocking her, but he also dared to shift the blame onto someone else. However, Tadao-kun angrily declared that this boy was a nobody at the academy, that he did not belong there, and therefore proposed that he be expelled. Hearing this, the beauty calmly replied that only her classmate was not fit for the academy, and no one else. But he began to boast, saying that he had the best results in the entire course, and that he was the only one who could stand on equal footing with her, but not that trash. The young man continued to stand his ground, noting that he was the best. He then stated that the girl should just think about the fact that Minato Kusagani would not protect her. He suggested that she look at him, a talented guy who was offering her a relationship. With indifference in her eyes and voice, Mizuha Yuka proudly declared that her detractor could continue to dream about it. Hearing this, the villain opened his mouth in surprise, so stunned that he couldn't utter a word. And while her classmate was putting on a show, the girl continued to say that she would never date someone who mocked others, someone who was prone to cruelty. Watching this whole spectacle, our hero thought that there was nothing strange about it, although it did evoke a little pity. After thinking about it, the director said that it seemed that the blame lay with Tadao and his friends, and that Kusanagi had used magic for self-defense. Therefore, he declared aloud that they did not need people who used magic to satisfy their selfish desires, and so he expelled the boys who had started the fight. The upset boys said it was unfair because they were only following their friends' orders. Smiling, the teacher said that Kusagani and Mizuha could now be free. Walking down the hallway, the student was angry, saying that it was really low, and she hadn't felt such indignation in a long time. Our hero didn't understand what would happen to these people after their expulsion, but the student explained that they would no longer be able to become magicians, which was only natural for guys like them. Looking at Minato Kusagani, the beauty declared that he was also good. How could he remain silent after everything that had been said about him? The young man noted to himself that he was going to speak, but at that moment the girl began to speak, and he did not want to interrupt her. Looking at her classmate in surprise, the beauty realized that he wanted to ask something, so she asked him what it was. Suddenly, the young man said that the thought had come to him suddenly, but it was not the first time the girl had tried to help him out. It had been in class, during a real battle training session, and now. Then he started talking about how Mizuha Yuka was actually amazingly good. After hearing this, the girl froze in place, blushed, and now had no idea what to say. Running away, the embarrassed student asked him not to say such things to her anymore, and immediately declared that she would go ahead. The guy decided not to say anything. He just stood there and smiled. For a moment, the young man thought that his true self had died, but he had been reborn as a new person. Perhaps because the true owner of this body had left due to bullying. Although our hero understood that death could have been the result of a car accident, and there was nothing mysterious about it, it is impossible to know for sure. But the bullies got their punishment, and now they will not be able to use magic for bad things. At that time, the director was telling someone that there were students who had used magic outside the academy, as well as those who had been involved in it all. He immediately added that, fortunately, none of the civilians had been injured. The girl standing opposite did not understand why she had been called, but the man explained that one of the participants was Yuika. As she left, the girl explained that she understood the situation and thanked them for telling her about it. After that, the director told the student not to forget to say hello to their father. The beauty assured the director that he could rest assured, because her father was interested in investing in the academy. Walking down the hallway, the guys thought that Kusagani had some serious magic, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to fight several magicians at once. However, the girl was not afraid of him. She honestly said that she had other plans for this young man, although she did not specify what they were. The beauty's companion wanted to know what they would do next, but she was in no hurry to reveal her plans. She said that for starters, it would be good to find out how strong this student was, and then move on from there. In addition, Mizuha Ruka wanted to know if her younger sister would dare to leave the academy after everything that had happened. Katsuragi Ryuji added that it all sounded very interesting. Lying on his desk, our hero looked out the window, not wanting to think about anything, feeling a sense of peace. At that moment, his classmates were enjoying a video in which Kusanagi Minato had saved a drunk man and dealt with a predator the day before. The guy hadn't seen the video, but he heard that it was about some kind of magician, so he thought that he might belong to the aristocracy. However, a moment later, the young man sighed deeply and thought that, in principle, it was none of his business. Just as Kusanagi Minato was about to sink back into his own thoughts, his teacher called out to him. The man said that not everyone had passed the magic power assessment last time, so now they would have to do it again. Our hero thought to himself that this device had been repaired very quickly. Mizuha Yuika, who was standing behind the young man, thought that she would finally find out his true power. However, in the next moment, everyone gathered. They turned their heads in surprise and looked somewhere. The students noticed that their classmate's sister was standing in front of them. The girl herself did not understand why her sister had come here, because they had not discussed anything like this. Looking at Minato Kusagani, the girl wondered if it was possible that Ruka had come to see this particular person. Perhaps because she also found his power suspicious. A few minutes later, our hero approached the same machine as last time. The guy thought to himself that he had already broken everything once, so now he needed to be careful. The young man carefully placed his hand on the stone, watching the glow of his mana. It was clear that the young man was very nervous, because he did not want a repeat of what had happened before. At one point, the numbers on the device spun around, but it was difficult to predict the outcome of this test. After finishing it, Minato Kusagani was panting as if he had been running for half a day. Looking ahead, the teacher said that it seemed that everything had gone well this time. Mizuha Yuka also looked closely at the scoreboard, but was surprised because the elements were marked as absent. The girl's sister and her friend were standing nearby, listening intently to what the teacher was saying. But he looked closely at the board and didn't know how to explain what he saw. Hearing that the magic level was at 100, the classmates were very surprised, and at the same time, they began to discuss that this young man was completely unsuited for magic. Katsuragi Ryuji said aloud that this guy was able to defeat a whole gang, adding that there was definitely something wrong with the results. Unexpectedly, Mizuha Ruka told her friend that it was time for them to leave, and that everything was clear. The other students continued to laugh and say that our hero was so tired because his level of magic was simply negligible. The teacher approached the young man and told him not to worry about it, because the amount of magic was not the whole picture. The girl standing on the sidelines understood that all this was extremely strange. She knew that Kusagani's real power was such that he was able to defeat the magical guard, and that he must possess fire element magic, as well as non-elemental magic. However, she had not yet heard that the amount of magic could be regulated, and therefore did not understand how the young man was able to deceive everyone. Meanwhile, Kusagami Minato was trying to recover, realizing that he had expended a lot of energy. At the same time, the guy praised himself for doing a great job because the result was flawless. He knew that the magical power had to be adjusted as precisely as possible, and it was exhausting. But the trick worked, and that was the most important thing. Moving down the corridor, the young man asked his classmate why she was also in the assessment room. However, the girl did not have time to answer the question because at that moment they were stopped. Standing in front of them were our heroine's sister and her friend. Kusanagi Minato had not seen these people before, so he immediately asked who they were. The girl immediately introduced herself and her friend, saying that she was studying at this academy, but only in her 3rd year. The guy wanted to think about something to himself, but immediately changed his mind and asked what the young people wanted from them. Passing by the place where our hero was standing, the beauty declared that she had no business with the student. A moment later, Mizuha Ruka began lecturing her younger sister, saying that she was unable to stand up to the local teenage criminals. She immediately added that there were also rumors that he had been saved by a man whose strength was at the lowest and even ridiculous level. Embarrassed, Mizuha Yuika stood silently for a while, then said in a quiet voice that it was true. The indignant 3rd-year student began yelling at the girl again, upset that she was like that. The older sister pointed out that her younger sister was inferior to her in academics, sports, magic, and everything else. After that, she said in an icy tone that the best solution would be for the student to leave the academy. For a moment, our hero's acquaintance returned to her own thoughts. She remembered how her sister always seemed to be above her, and what's more, she was much more confident. However, she couldn't find any logical reasons for this, because they always trained on equal terms. But her older sister claimed that Mizuha Yuika had never been able to defeat her in anything. She immediately added that she was not cut out to be a mage, and if she was the only one in their family to become a mage, that would be enough. Stammering, the unfortunate girl wanted to argue but didn't know what to say. However, with a hint of desperation in her voice, Ruka added that it would be best to do exactly as she said. The girl saw that her sister was trembling, but repeated once again that it would be best to leave the academy and start attending a regular school. The beauty waited, confident that Yuika would not argue with her. But Yui only clenched her fist and tried to mumble something under her breath. But at that moment, Minato Kusanagi said that it all sounded very arrogant. Turning around, Ruka asked the guy what he had just said and asked him to repeat it. But he said that he heard the student talking non-stop and not letting the other person speak, and therefore it was nothing but arrogance, wasn't it? The girl didn't like this behavior, so she said that this was a family conversation, and that outsiders weren't allowed to speak. Hearing the guy say that it was an order, not a conversation, the student got angry and started yelling at Minato Kusagani. But he calmly pointed out that there was no need to impose one's lifestyle on others, as there was no reasonable basis for doing so, even when it came to family members. But Ruka said that it would be wise to give up on an impossible dream because her sister had no talent for magic, and immediately pointed out that she had never achieved her goals. With tears in her eyes, Yuika thought to herself that she really had no talent. All this time, she had only been trying to convince herself otherwise. The girl told herself that she had the necessary qualities, but that wasn't entirely true. Indeed, it was hard to argue that her sister was much stronger, and it was difficult to compete with her. Smiling, our hero declared with complete confidence that this time she would win. Her classmate looked at the young man intently, but had no idea why he had decided to say that. The older sister watched in amazement, unable to believe that someone would dare to contradict her, especially on such a matter. But our hero hastened to explain that the victory would not be now or here, of course. And the girl agreed. So she asked how about holding it in 2 weeks. It could be a magical 2-on-2 duel. Kusanagi Minato smiled. For him, it was all an interesting adventure, the likes of which he hadn't encountered in a long time. Mizu Haruka noted that after all this insolence, it was likely that the young man was going to run away, but he replied firmly that this was not the case at all, because he was also going to take part in the duel. Putting his hands in his pockets, our hero turned to his acquaintance and asked how she intended to proceed in this case. The embarrassed student looked intently in front of her, seemingly unsure of what to do in this situation. The girl began to stammer. It was clear that she wanted to prove herself, but she was afraid. However, a minute later, she proudly announced that she was also going to participate. The cheerful guy looked at his classmate and said that they could consider everything settled. He added that if he and Mizuhara Yuika won, then no one would ever interfere in their affairs again. Immediately, the older sister said that if they won, her younger sister would leave the academy. As they left, the guys warned that no one would hold back, so it would be a real fight. After a while, our heroes went outside, and Mizuhara Yuika timidly asked her acquaintance for a favor. Suddenly, the girl asked the young man to become her mentor in magic. Hearing this, the young man was surprised. He didn't understand why he was being called to the roof and asked to do such unexpected things. That is why he said that he was a low-level mage with a power level of 100 points. Yet despite this, the student asked him to become her mentor, which sounded ridiculous. But the girl honestly said that the guy was hiding his real strength. She was sure that he was much stronger than her. The young man looked closely at his acquaintance, but did not understand what to do in this case. But his classmate continued to insist that the teenager definitely knew how to become stronger, which is why he talked about defeating over her sister. Otherwise, he would not have said such a thing. After thinking about it, Minato Kusagani decided that people like his acquaintance always see everything as black or white, which is why she provoked him into that fight. A moment later, the beauty lowered her head and began to cry, realizing that she was too weak to compete. Realizing that there was no choice anyway, the young man sighed deeply and agreed to help. Lifting her head, his classmate stammered and asked if it was really true, and if she was so lucky. But the guy added sharply that anything was possible, provided that the girl strictly followed what he said and, moreover, did not run away halfway through. Seeing the joy in Mizuki Yuika's eyes, The guy realized that he couldn't refuse when she asked so ardently. Moreover, this country needed higher-level magicians, so the lessons would not be superfluous. Looking ahead, the teenager said that they would start today, but he did not know which place would be best for this. Embarrassed, the beauty timidly suggested that they could practice in her yard. After a while, everything was ready, so the guys were about to begin. But while the girl was warming up, our hero looked around and said that the family's house was very large, hearing that they were aristocrats, and therefore it should be so. But a moment later, Mizuha Yuika thought about the fact that this was the first time she had brought a boy to her house. She didn't understand if it looked strange from the outside, although there seemed to be nothing unusual about it. Realizing that the warm-up was taking too long, the boy turned to his friend and said that it was time to start. Otherwise they would waste too much time. The beauty, hearing her name called, immediately blushed and began to ask questions about it. But the guy immediately explained that her sister had the same last name, so it would be strange if he called both sisters by that name. And if he called one of them, it would not be immediately clear which one he meant. Mizuha Yuika immediately became embarrassed when she heard the young man say that he could address her differently. Realizing that it was time to begin, the young man smiled and happily said that they would now get started. First, the young man asked his acquaintance to answer a question about what magical power is. With joy in her voice, the hostess immediately began to say that it could be a program that automatically transforms magical power into magic. She added that it is impossible to increase power through intention, that the amount of magic is determined at birth, and that at a certain age, its growth stops. The cheerful beauty was confident that she had answered the questions perfectly, and therefore expected praise. But the guy immediately stated honestly that none of the answers were correct. The surprised classmate could not understand how this was possible, since she knew everything perfectly. After thinking for a moment, Minato Kusagani decided that modern magicians were all so ignorant. He found it strange that in 50 years, everything had changed so much, but not for the better. But the guy decided to explain right away that magical power is not only in bodies but also in nature, that spells have a supporting function in any case, and that it is possible to increase magical power with the help of intention. The surprised hostess shouted that this simply could not be true, because if it were, the science of magic would be turned upside down. Closing his eyes, our hero noted that one could choose not to believe what he was saying, but he was simply explaining the answers to the questions. After that, the guy asked the girl to sit on the ground and let the magical power flow, adding that when she felt this power, she should say so. Mizuha Yuika did not know what that could be, but the young man noted that if it did not happen, she would never become stronger. After that, the teenager said that he would touch the beauty's back, and she would have to concentrate at that moment. In a moment, the energy around the young people turned blue, and a kind of silence reigned around them. Kusanagi Minato realized that his student was silent, and decided that there was not enough energy, so he added a little more, knowing that this would definitely work. Suddenly, the student opened her eyes and cried out that something had happened. She felt warmth in her back. Turning her head, the beauty asked if it was really the perception of magic. And while Mizuha Yuika described her extraordinary emotions, the young man declared that she must remember this feeling. He added that if she could feel it, she could identify it, and then see the magical power of natural objects. So that was what she should strive for first. The joyful girl said that she was a descendant of a great family, so she would definitely be able to handle it. And while the beauty was rejoicing, the guy thought that this had only happened after a decent flow of magical power, and therefore it seemed that Yuiki had no talent for magic. A week later, gathered in the same courtyard, the student screamed and cried because she couldn't do anything right. This did not please Kusanagi Minato, who thought that a whole week of serious practice had gone by, but his classmates still had not mastered the basics. However, the young man did not want to give up so easily, so he said that he would send the magical flow again. A moment later, the young man touched his friend's back, hoping that something would work this time. Realizing that it was over, our hero said that the girl could now carefully open her eyes. Suddenly, Mizuki Yuika's eyes widened, and she cried out that she could now actually see. The joyful girl asked if this was really the magical power her friend had told her about. She looked at her hand and couldn't get enough of what she saw. The beauty said she couldn't believe she could see mana so easily. Turning around, the student decided that now she would most likely be able to see the powerful force of her mentor. However, for some reason, Mizuha Yuika could only see a faint blue outline. And while the guy praised his acquaintance, she shyly stated that it wasn't difficult at all, and therefore, of course, she couldn't fail. Realizing that the lesson should continue, Minato Kusanagi went on to tell his classmate that after she learned to perceive mana, she needed to learn to control it. It is very important to monitor the amount of mana used, the main task being to use this energy as efficiently as possible. If all the mana is used up, it will eventually be restored, and its amount will increase. Since Mizuha Yuika had learned to perceive mana, she should have no problem controlling it. Closing his eyes, the guy began to say that everything he was saying was far from what they taught at the academy, which was hard to believe. But the girl immediately shouted that she believed him. She immediately added that she now completely trusted her mentor. The young man liked that the girl was so inspired, so he announced that in that case they would move on to the next stage, and therefore the student needed to prepare herself. The young man wanted it to look impressive, so he took off his jacket and told the hostess not to be afraid and to attack him. Getting ready, Mizuha Yuika noted that she would do everything in her power, but the guy also had to show what he was capable of. The girl knew that to start with, she would use first-rank power, which included water discs. Our hero had seen this countless times before, so he just stood still and watched. However, in the next moment, Kusanagi Minato stretched out his arm and put up something like a shield. The surprised student suddenly said aloud that for some reason her spell had disappeared. The guy explained that the first rank was an elemental magic barrier, and if the girl couldn't break it, she definitely wouldn't be able to defeat his sister. The beauty seemed to understand what she had been told, so she decided to try again. While setting up a defense, the young man told the student not to forget to keep moving, and added that if she stopped fighting the mage, she could immediately consider herself defeated. Mizuha Yuika was a good student, so she directed all her strength towards her opponent, saying that she was now attacking with full force. A few minutes later, falling to the ground, the beauty honestly said that she could no longer train. Approaching his friend, the young man noted that this was not all. The most important part was still ahead of them. He explained that if the girl learned to control her mana, she would not need to cast spells. Having created a magic circle, our hero decided to show how his student uses magic using one of the examples. After that, he focused on the principle that only he understood, demonstrating that the difference was enormous, because in his case, the energy was directed forward. Mizuha Yuika, sitting nearby, now understood that her mana was simply dissipating. A moment later, the teenager explained that magic could be used without casting spells, but only if one knew how to control mana. The hostess of the house did not believe that such a thing was possible, but the boy noted that it was a little difficult for now, but in the future, it would be possible. He added that for now, she needed to learn how to shorten spells, and then, when she learned to control her mana, she would be able to completely abandon all spells. By shortening spells, it was possible to gain a significant advantage in battle, as well as save a lot of mana while casting them. Hearing the young man say that she needed to continue, Mizuha Yuika was a little surprised, but the young man explained that she needed to consolidate the knowledge she had gained, otherwise it would be meaningless. He immediately added that the student should act as if she were on the verge of death. The frightened student looked intently at Kusanagi Minato as if she were looking at a monster rather than a human being. Realizing that the beauty was lying on the ground again, our hero noted that they would have to do this every day, but now the student didn't want to hear about it. That same evening, Minato Kusagani went to Harajuku to investigate. Realizing that the situation in the country was not the best, the teenager noted to himself that monsters also lived in this place, and moreover, no matter how many of them were exterminated, their numbers did not decrease, so it was unclear where this would lead. Suddenly, the young man heard something and immediately turned around to look. He saw a huge monster watching the man on the balcony intently. That's why the young man immediately jumped up from his seat and ran to where his help was needed. The teenager saw a little girl who was watching the monster intently, but she just stood there silently. Appearing suddenly, Minato Kusagani immediately began to ask if she was all right, but instead of answering, she immediately took out her phone and started filming the guy and his actions. The young man did not want to be noticed, so after finishing his work, he immediately left as quickly as he had appeared. Pulling his hood tighter, the young man said that who knew the stranger would start taking pictures without even saying thank you, so it was unclear what kind of people they were. On his way home, our hero decided that next time he would probably have to bring a mask. The next day, the young man came to his classmate's house again to continue their lessons. After a few tricks, the girl fell to the ground again, showing that it was all difficult for her. Lying on the ground, Mizuha Yuika tried to catch her breath, realizing that it wasn't as easy as she had initially thought. Watching this, the guy thought that there were only a few days left before the competition, and although there was progress, it wasn't enough. Objectively, the teenager understood that his friend was inferior to her older sister in everything, and if that was the case, then even with persistent training, she would not be able to win. The young man honestly said that the student might give up, but as she got up, Mizuha Yuika said that she had always been compared to Ruka, that she herself had never been better at anything, and that was why she had given up so much. She immediately added that she would never give up magic. Kusanagi Minato now said aloud that the girl, studying at such a pace, would not be able to win because there was still a lot to go through. But his acquaintance shouted loudly that in that case, her mentor should be much tougher on her. Smiling, the young man noted that in that case, he was not going to hold back. The beauty liked this approach, saying that it would be easier and more interesting for her to face someone who used their strength to the maximum. However, the next minute, the teenager began to show the girl something to help her pass a difficult level. After that, the guys went back to the practical part so as not to waste precious time. By the end of the evening, Minato Kusanagi was literally carrying his acquaintance in his arms because she had completely used up all her mana. Standing in the courtyard, Mizuha Yuika watched her mentor closely, but she remained silent. He smiled and said enthusiastically that the girl had succeeded. Falling to the ground, the beauty cried out loudly that this was the moment she had been waiting for so long. The young man said again and again that his student had not spared herself and had given her all, and what's more, she had done everything as she had been told. Listening to this, the mistress enjoyed everything that was said, realizing that this was exactly what she had always strived for. A few days later, the moment arrived when the competition that everyone had been waiting for was to take place. While talking, the guys saw someone's shadows, but couldn't figure out who was approaching them, so they were very surprised. The young people looked closely, but despite this, they couldn't make anything out. But in a moment, the strangers came closer, and then the students saw that they were representatives of the press, who immediately began to ask for comments about the upcoming match. The guy didn't understand how the media representatives got there, but the girl explained that it was all related to their family, so there was nothing strange about it. Looking at his friend, Minato Kusanagi thought that at this time, all the battles in which aristocrats took part were probably very important. At the same time, people were already gathering in the stands, eagerly awaiting the start of the show. Responding to the young man's question about the scale of the event, his classmate noted that such things rarely happened, and therefore, it was quite an event. For a moment, the teenager looked at his acquaintance. He wanted to say something to her but couldn't bring himself to do so. A minute later, the host invited the participants to come on stage because the competition was about to begin. At one point, Mizuha Yuika stopped and leaned against a metal pipe, her face showing fear and despair. The guy saw her condition, so he calmly told her to do everything she could, and that the rest didn't matter. These words had some effect because the beauty immediately straightened up and looked at her mentor. After that, the student smiled and walked forward with confidence, saying that she remembered everything. On her way to the stage, Mizuha Yuika thought about how lucky she was to have met such an amazing person whose words touched her heart. When the girl entered the ring, her older sister was already waiting for her there. Folding her arms across her chest, she declared in a haughty tone that the student had come, not run away. Our heroine had no intention of explaining anything, so she said that of course, she hadn't run away. Her older sister continued to taunt her, asking if Yui really planned to win. She immediately added, asking if she really wanted to defeat a magician like her. It seemed that the girl had gained some confidence, so she shouted that of course she was going to do it. But Ruka wouldn't let up, saying that in a couple of weeks her sister had gotten too big for her boots. Standing opposite her, she understood that her sister was strong and therefore should not be underestimated. Therefore, she was afraid to think about the difference in magical power between them. Despite this, Mizuha Yuika was in a fighting mood. She didn't want to give in, but now her main goal was simply to show what she was capable of. And while the girls stood facing each other, the host announced that the duel was open. A moment later, he added that the students were officially allowed to begin the battle. Getting ready, our heroine thought that she should read a shorter spell, but instead concentrate on her strength. It seemed that her sister had read her movements and immediately put up a defense. Kusanagi Minato thought that constant movement was the main tactic, and it was clear that Ruka was also aware of the battle between magicians. But Yuika was so nervous that she forgot about this method. Therefore, the advantage in spell speed was lost, so it was difficult to say how events would unfold. Our hero's protege decided that she would start this duel with the first rank in water discs. But the sister immediately understood what her opponent was going to do, so she immediately put up a defense for herself. Everyone gathered watched closely as the two streams of water actively opposed each other. Although a moment later, Yuka felt herself being drenched by the water her sister was directing at her. But that was not bad. The girl noted to herself that she had somehow managed to compensate, and therefore it could be said that she had actually become stronger. Her older sister noticed this too, and haughtily declared that, compared to before, her sister had improved, and she had managed to do so in just a couple of weeks. The heroine was encouraged by this remark because, even though it didn't sound very flattering, it was definitely praise. But the sister did not understand what her opponent was happy about, so she asked about it, feeling embarrassed. She immediately stated that she had only made a comparison, and therefore there was no praise involved. After that, she proudly announced that she had decided to raise her rank because that way the competition would last as long as possible. Unexpectedly, the battle began again, and now Mizuha Yuika realized that the restraint was not going as well as the first time. The water blitz belonged to the second rank, and its difficulty lay in its more powerful flow. Our hero's student felt it and understood that the power of water was very strong. Kusanagi Minato, who was standing nearby, saw the girl fall to the ground because she couldn't defend herself. The guy looked at his classmate with some regret, but remained silent. He thought to himself that if this were a competition for spell speed, Yuika would have a better chance of winning. But in this case, her opponent was superior. Walking towards her sister, Ruka said with irritation in her voice that there was an insensitive young man standing in front of her who wasn't even going to help her friend get up. But the teenager calmly stated that there was no need for that at all. The girl did not understand why the young man said that, so she asked him about it again. However, there was no answer, because in the next minute, the unfortunate girl who was lying on the ground began to slowly get up. The surprised rival only remarked that this was foolish, hinting that she should stay down, because it was a direct hit of the second rank, which is considered serious. But Mizuha Yuika proudly declared that she would not give up her victory so easily, and therefore would not give up just like that. She immediately added that magic was all she had, so even if she lost in other areas, she would never lose in magic. After that, the girl directed a powerful stream of energy toward her sister, and it was really powerful, because the student managed to put up a defense at the last minute, realizing that she could be doused with water. At that moment, it seemed that our hero's protege actually had a chance of winning because she started very well. But after a couple of minutes, it became clear that the younger sister was struggling to stand on her feet, although she said that she would never give up and would show everything she was capable of. Suddenly, everyone noticed the student fall to the ground. At that moment, the host loudly announced that Mizuha Yuika's magic had been completely exhausted, and therefore the victory was awarded to her opponent, who showed with her whole appearance that she was quite worthy of it. Trying to get up, our hero's acquaintance whispered to herself that she had failed. Approaching her, the young man thought that it was a competition, whose outcome depended on the amount of magic used, in accordance with the coordination of magical power, and that his classmate had lost. Folding her arms across her chest, the rival said that it was obvious to everyone that her sister had no talent, and instead of confirming this, Kusanagi Minato simply played along with her. Standing up, the young man declared that the girl really had no talent. And, looking at the tearful Mizuha Yuika, he continued to say that she was clumsy, had not achieved any particular success, lacked understanding of the essence, and her performance was weak. But with a broad smile, he proudly said that she had perseverance. The girl practiced every day, sometimes even to the point of foolishness, but she still continued to work hard. But her older sister immediately stated that the result of all this was perfectly clear. The student had simply lost. But the young man was not going to stop there. He said that he liked hardworking people like his classmate. However, she said nothing. She just sat on the ground and cried. At that moment, Minato Kusagani declared that Yuika was his student, and therefore he would not tolerate anyone speaking ill of her. After these words, the girl cried as bitterly as she could, realizing that she had let her mentor down, and that he was now ashamed of her. At that moment, Ruka spoke up, saying that it was probably an honor for someone whose magic power rating was 100. But our hero was not affected by these words at all. On the contrary, he calmly replied that a mage with a level of 100 points would easily defeat her. The girl immediately stated that this was not the first time Kusanagi Minato had spoken arrogantly, but that she would not be his opponent. Warming up his hands, Katsuragi Ryuji happily announced that it was probably his turn to show what he was capable of. Passing by her friend, the girl told him to finish the competition as soon as possible. Our hero had no intention of leaving his student behind, so he carefully picked her up and carried her to the spectator seats. After putting her in her seat, the young man told her to watch his fight carefully and catch every move. At that moment, the student caught herself thinking that her body didn't hurt for some reason, and there were almost no traces of abrasions left. Entering the ring, the young man thought that it would look simple to everyone, and therefore he could not fight at full strength. His magical power had to be without spells and without elements, and since he would have to do without a magical barrier, a direct hit from magic could kill him, and therefore, no matter how you look at it, such conditions could cause concern. Rolling up his sleeves, The opponent said he would not hold back, but immediately heard our hero remark that in that case, he would have to hold back. The crowd in the stands cheered, and the guys talked about Katsuragi Ryuji showing at least a little mercy to this weakling. Looking at his opponent, Minato Kusanagi thought that his stats were around 8,000, which would not be a problem under normal circumstances, but now that everyone knew that the young man's stats were 100, one mistake could cost him his life. At that moment, the host announced to everyone gathered that the duel was open. Spreading powerful circles, the senior happily declared that there would be no mercy, and sending out energy, he wondered how this teenager had managed to defeat a gang of hooligans. Although he immediately decided that now everything would become clear to him. The young man was curious to see if this youth could withstand all his power. Unexpectedly, something happened that no one present had expected, because a powerful stream of energy struck his opponent on the forehead. Stretching out his hand, our hero calmly said that his opponent was simply too late. Silence fell on the stands. The guys couldn't understand what had happened and why it had happened so quickly. At that moment, the host announced that the competition was over, and that Kusanagi Minato had won. Ruka, who ran up to her friend, couldn't understand how he had lost consciousness from just one blow. Moreover, she hadn't heard the guy recite any spell, so it was strange what kind of trick had been used. Kusanagi Minato, passing by the girl, noted indifferently that he had finished quickly, as she had requested. At this time, Mizuha Yuika continued to point out again and again that her mentor had defeated a guy who was much higher in rank than himself. But our heroine's sister had no intention of stopping, as she did not want to accept such a pitiful defeat, and therefore tried to prove something to her student. Looking at this beauty, the young man reflected on the fact that she was stronger than his comrade. Unexpectedly, the judges announced that the composition of the second competition had changed, and added that they had high hopes for Kusagani's fighting abilities. They added that the participant who won this round would determine the victory of the team, and therefore the second duel could be considered started. A moment later, Kusagami Minato began to take action, realizing that he could not delay. His opponent, watching this, immediately put up some kind of defense and began muttering something under her breath. The young man thought that with his score at 100, it was natural that his magic power was low. Therefore, if he didn't aim for his opponent's head, there would be practically no effect. Moreover, the young man didn't understand whether it was better to defend himself or not to move at all. It seemed that the girl was quite skilled in magic, so she decided to attack first to show what she was capable of. The stream of water was so strong that it was difficult to even see the arena behind it. However, after a moment the student stopped and realized that it was a stupid move. Kusanagi Minato stood motionless and continued to do so, as if there had been no attack at all. Surprised, Ruka couldn't understand how it was possible that her opponent didn't have a single bruise, and what's more, it looked as if the student hadn't used any magic at all. The participants sitting in the stands clearly saw how the girl directed a huge stream of water at the boy, but he didn't even get wet. Our hero's student was happy for him, but she also wanted to know what technique he had used. His rival had no intention of giving up. She knew she would find out what trick he had used anyway, but for now she decided to attack again. The young man was ready for this, so he dodged the water as quickly as he could. Fortunately, his speed allowed him to do so. At that moment, the student seemed to understand what was going on, and this surprised her even more. Because why dodge when you can use magic? Sitting in her seat, Mizuha Yuika reasoned that magic opposes magic, even if there is a difference in power. But the young man reduces it a little, and if he doesn't do so, it will obviously be dangerous. When it comes to the second rank, speed and mass are different, so it shouldn't be possible for our hero to dodge. It's also interesting that the student seems to have completely no sense of fear. Kusanagi Minato understood that his opponent was carefully considering all his actions, as well as how he managed to dodge. But this is not difficult to do if you know how to track magical power. Getting ready, the girl decided that in this case, she would act even more aggressively until she could win. Therefore, the beauty decided to use the third rank and the Azure Splash, which was one of the most powerful. The guys sitting in the stands began to talk about how if the boy was hit directly by the jet, he would be in big trouble. Sitting down on the ground, the tired contestant was sure that no one could dodge such a blow. But the next minute, a bright beam of light hit her right in the forehead, just as it had happened to her friend a little earlier. Looking up at the student, Ruka did not understand why he was unharmed. She was curious how he had managed to dodge it so easily, but he explained that he had used a magic drain that absorbed magic, and then simply walked through it. The girl sat on the ground and watched the furrows on the ground closely. She didn't know what to say, so she continued to stare ahead. Suddenly, the beauty laughed as loudly as she could, not believing that it was possible to walk through some kind of furrows. But then, Raising her head to the sky, she declared that she and her companion had suffered a complete defeat. At that moment, the judge loudly announced that Kusanagi Minato had won this round as well. A joyful Mizuha Yuika immediately ran to her mentor and asked if he was okay, but her sister, whom no one had addressed, also noted that she was fine. The guy didn't say or explain anything. He just calmly noted that they had managed to win. His classmate was happy to hear this, so she just looked into her friend's eyes. Getting up from the ground, the older sister said that, as promised, she would no longer interfere, so the guys could now do whatever they wanted. The young man said nothing, but he sighed heavily. When the student walked away, the young man said that Mizuha Ruka had given in because her sister's injuries were almost invisible, but she had fought him with all her strength, even though she had started to deny everything. After that, the teenager noted that it must be acknowledged that his younger sister had actually become stronger during this time, and therefore it was not necessary to be so protective of her. Hearing the conversation, the girl immediately shouted that she would become even stronger over time, so Ruka wouldn't need to worry about her so much or take care of her. Bowing her head, she noted with some sadness that she understood everything. But a second later, the young man smiled as he watched the sisters look at each other. Suddenly, something changed, so the guy raised his head sharply and looked up. Minato Kusagani clearly sensed foreign magic that was very close. At that moment, everyone gathered on the podium shouted that it was some kind of disaster. The classmates who had been expelled a few weeks earlier were now rummaging through the students' belongings and saying that they would rob everyone while the duel was going on. One of the ill-wishers stated that there was nothing useful except textbooks and added that Kusagi was too clean. Tadano-kun was angry, saying that he didn't need money but proof that this boy was hiding something, because how could he use such powerful magic? Suddenly, one of the students stopped and looked out the window in horror. He heard another guy ask why he was silent, but he couldn't say anything. Unexpectedly, the red-haired boy's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Standing in front of the window, the students noticed that the sky had suddenly turned red for some reason, although they did not know why. And while the blonde guy tried to say that a disaster had begun, the other guy declared that it was all nonsense, that such a thing couldn't be happening. Our hero, standing in the middle of the arena, understood everything himself, but found it difficult to believe. The girls also couldn't take their eyes off it and were unable to move. Other students were also actively discussing this phenomenon, but they were sure that no catastrophe could happen. Only Minato Kusagani knew what it was, although he couldn't understand the reasons, but he suspected that it might be related to the fact that they were in Shinjuku. A moment later, the boy thought about how he remembered very well that the first disaster had also begun in this place, and while our hero was pondering the coincidences, he did not immediately notice the monsters that appeared so suddenly that they frightened everyone present. The teacher understood that the situation was tense, but tried to remain calm and therefore asked the students not to run or panic. Suddenly, everyone present saw a powerful stream of light, which immediately knocked all the predators to the ground. Our hero, realizing that the students were frightened, decided to tell them himself to remain completely calm. The children looked intently at the young man, who seemed to have taken control of the situation. Kusanagi Minato continued to explain that only small monsters appear at the beginning of the disaster, so everything will be fine if they act calmly, adding that everyone needs to evacuate to the gym. Approaching the girls, the teenager told them to do the same, but heard a question about what he himself wanted to do. Turning around, the student said confidently that he would go to rescue the people who remained in the school building, which surprised the teacher, who said that going alone was reckless. At that moment, Katsuragi Ryuji spoke up, saying that he would also go, and if everything went as the student said, there would be no problems. The teacher wanted to say something, but heard that everyone had already seen Kusanagi in action, so he allowed it, but only without unnecessary heroism. Our hero heard the question addressed to him about whether the third-year student would die, but he just shrugged his shoulders. Approaching his ward, Kusagami Minato explained to her in a soft voice that it was time for him to go. The frightened beauty asked only that he be as careful as possible. On the way, Katsuragi Ryuji happily shouted that they would go first. He thought to himself that running 100 meters in 10 seconds was the easiest task for them, and immediately asked the guy if he could do the same. But in a moment, the young man not only managed to do it, but somehow he practically overtook the one he had competed with earlier that day. And agreeing with his partner that he was right, they would indeed be the first to come to the rescue. Accelerating with every second, Katsuragi Ryuji rejoiced at their incredible speed. He immediately added that speed alone did not determine the outcome, so he wanted to see their true strength in battle, and he also wanted to save everyone. At that moment, Minato Kusanagi thought to himself that the magical power index in the school building felt like 58. but perhaps there were people who did not possess magic. Only a couple of seconds separated the young man from finally entering the building and seeing what was going on there. And what was happening was that the monsters were actually inside, where the other students remained. The boy saw this clearly, so he decided to hurry, realizing that there was a lot of work to do and he needed to get everywhere. Without further ado, our hero immediately began to use magic to destroy all the predators that were in the room. Kusanagi Minato could do incredible things, and he made good use of it. At the same time, the teenager shouted that it was necessary to quickly go around the entire building. At some point, our hero thought he had neutralized everyone, and the beast behind him was about to attack. But this was just a trick on the part of the young man, who immediately raised his hand and directed the energy back. At that moment, the student heard his partner addressing him, asking how the young man was doing. He was standing among the corpses of predators, with a surprised female student next to him. But overall, everything was fine. Passing by the third-year student, the young man calmly stated that he trusted him with their evacuation, meaning some of the students. Suddenly, the young man stopped and said that it was very dangerous to go on alone. The student wanted to say something else, but he only saw dust on the floor, which indicated that his partner had left, so he silently said that Minato Kusanagi's speed was truly incredible. And then, scratching behind his ear, he decided that in this case he was a burden, although he really understood that he could not argue. The reason was that the teenager had defeated a crowd of magical creatures in a matter of seconds. But what interested him most was the question of who this young man was. Running down the corridor, Minato Kusanagi thought that if magical projectiles could be dealt with outside the walls in one go, then inside the building, they could hit the students. Therefore, there was nothing left to do but destroy these predators at a steady pace with low-level magic. That's exactly what the guy started doing as soon as he got there and saw one of the dangerous creatures in front of him. The kids were screaming, but it was unclear whether they were afraid of the beasts or surprised that the magic worked so unusually. Looking at these students, the young man thought that he couldn't leave them here because it was dangerous, but he also couldn't accompany all the rescued people to the evacuation zone one by one. At that moment, Katsuragi Ryuji shouted loudly to the students that while he was dealing with the beast, they should run quickly. However, in the next moment, one young man pointed at something and immediately began to shout loudly. They were students from the school who were in some kind of green spheres that moved easily through the air like ordinary balls. But the boy couldn't understand what had lifted them so high. This surprised the third-year student. He had never seen anything like it, although he guessed who could have done it. Looking out the window, our hero smiled at his partner, confident that he could now handle it himself. Suddenly, something alarmed Minato Kusagani, and he realized that he had to return to his reality. In another room, another student was sitting, pressed against the wall, begging the monster not to come near her. But the problem was that there were several of these predators, and what's more, they had trapped the poor girl. With every passing second, the girl's fear became more and more indescribable, and she tried to call for help in a trembling voice. Then she started crying and screaming at the top of her lungs, hoping that someone would be nearby. However, at that moment, something extraordinary happened, because a bright stream of light literally flooded the entire room. The beauty rose from her seat and looked in surprise at everything that was happening. Suddenly, the girl remembered what had happened a couple of weeks ago in Shibuya when they were doing their class, and decided that she was now seeing the same miracle. Kusanagi Minato, who appeared in the room a moment later, asked his frightened classmate if she was all right. After these words, the girl's surprise grew even greater, and she began to feel embarrassed, so she could hardly say that she realized it was he who had saved her. Scratching his head, the young man modestly stated that this was indeed the case. The girl decided to ask what she wanted to know, so she inquired about the practical classes and received an affirmative answer. Starting to cry again, the student began to thank our hero, saying that he had saved her twice already. However, the guy did not like fame. He did not want to be considered some kind of incredible person, so he said that it was completely normal. The girl, folding her arms across her chest, now stood silently but watched the student intently. Finally, the prolonged silence was broken by Katsuragi Ryuji, who, out of breath, asked who else needed help and who else could be saved. Climbing the stairs, the young man told his classmate to follow the senior, who would take her to a safe place. But the beauty was in no hurry to do so, because she was mesmerized by the sight of the young man quickly walking away. Moving on, Minato Kusagani realized that there were still a decent number of people who needed help, and there was no time to wait for the police. He had to act even faster. At that moment, a meeting was taking place in an office, and a gray-haired man was informing everyone that a disaster had begun at the Magic Academy. After that, all sorts of rumors spread throughout the office. Those gathered did not understand how this could be, because 50 years ago, all entities had been exterminated, and therefore, they could not return so easily and quickly. But the president continued to say that they were contacting the aristocracy and the Central Department of the Police Department for combating monsters, and that the ground forces of self-defense were already prepared. Once again, discontent swept through the hall, with many noting that they did not have enough magicians who could effectively fight monsters, which was a problem. The man knew this himself, and therefore thought that this was the downside of the peaceful situation after the disaster, with most of the military spending going towards defense in international affairs. The only ones capable of fighting monsters were the police and the magical aristocracy. But that was not enough. So the president slammed his fist on the table. The man was frightened that what happened 50 years ago could happen again, but now their country did not have a person like Ichigami Minato. Driving down the street in their car, the police officers discussed among themselves that there could be no mistake. The catastrophe had indeed begun. The blonde woman was frightened that nothing had happened for 50 years. Everything seemed so peaceful and calm, and everyone believed that it would always be that way. Police Inspector Shiru Shego was confident that they would somehow be able to cope with it. Sanada Karin, who was his colleague, also tried to cope with her fear, but it was difficult. However, the police did not know how things would actually unfold, so they did not want to discuss it. After a while, the press began to actively discuss the situation. Reporters claimed that the sky had suddenly turned red, and monsters were appearing one after another, and that it all started at a magic school. Other media representatives who managed to arrive at the scene reported from the sports hall, where they had managed to take shelter with the students. The teacher told his students that the only enemies they could see were magical beasts, and therefore he was convinced that together they could easily defeat them. Despite this, there were so many creatures that it was impossible to clear the area, so the students could not go anywhere. Passers-by who were watching the videos from the academy closely suddenly said that they were very close to that place. And in a moment, they realized that the monsters were not only in the educational institution, but now these entities were looking directly at them. Two unfamiliar men standing on the balcony of one of the buildings also watched the events closely, and could not believe that they were witnessing something like this. It seemed that they had never seen such a strange color of the sky, nor monsters that felt like they owned the city. However, there were also people who were not afraid at all, watching what was happening on their phones and just marveling at everything. But this did not apply to the older generation, who remembered very well how it was last time. At this time, our hero was rushing to rescue the next group of people. He understood that the whole place was swarming with monsters, and therefore realized that, most likely, the situation was gradually moving into the second phase. The monsters that appear become stronger as the phases progress, and no matter how many you kill, their numbers do not decrease. Until the boss is defeated, monsters will continue to appear continuously. The boss, in turn, appears in the last phase, so you need to hold out until that moment. The young man knew perfectly well that a disaster was a very troublesome affair. Looking up, he estimated that there were about 20 people in the capsules scattered throughout the building, which would make rescue difficult. Realizing that one wing was taken care of, Minato Kusanagi decided it was time to move on. At that moment, in one of the classrooms, our hero's tormentors were desperately fighting the monsters, realizing that they were in a difficult situation. Lowering his hand, Tadao-kun said sadly that he didn't have enough strength to fight these monsters for so long. The sad thing was that the guys were not facing ordinary magical beasts, but a guard, the same one who had appeared before them in the alley. With sadness in their voices, the students wondered why such a monster was in front of them again, and began to complain that they had stayed in class for so long, even though they should have left as early as possible. Our hero's opponent also cried out in despair, noting that Kusanagi would have defeated this monster in one fell swoop, but he couldn't do that and didn't understand why. And then he added to himself that he was weak, even though he had always considered himself to be as strong as possible. At that moment, everyone present noticed a powerful stream of light that illuminated the room. And just like in the alley, everything was enveloped in fog, and then separate pockets of fire appeared on the ground. And in the middle of all this chaos stood Minato Kusanagi, looking intently at the students who had been expelled. The young man didn't want to say anything. He didn't think it was necessary to sort things out, so he turned around and was about to leave. Sitting on the floor, the red-haired guy thought about how this teenager had appeared again and saved them, how history had repeated itself. But this time, the young man wanted to change it, so he asked our hero not to leave so quickly. The student asked why Kusanagi Minato had saved them, since he should hate everyone and not waste time destroying the guard. In a calm voice, the young man replied that there was no particular reason why he did it. It was just an opportunity, so he did what he did. Tadano-kun bowed his head and repeated everything he had just heard, and then he immediately shouted that he was being deceived, that it couldn't be true, that it was simply impossible, because the boy was untalented. He hardly ever used magic, and he couldn't do it, so how did he manage to become so strong? Turning around, the teenager honestly replied that Minato Kusanagi had once died in a car accident, and he had simply been reborn. But his classmates still didn't understand what had happened after the accident. Could it be that it was the accident that had made the guy so much stronger? Hearing about his opponent's strength, our hero approached and looked at him closely. Then he said that the strong do not oppress the weak, but the weak oppress those who are weaker than themselves, and that a sense of superiority can lead one to mistakenly believe that one is strong. In reality, standing in front of the guy is a person who would not even think of fighting him now. The young man knew he was right, so he didn't think it necessary to say anything else, since everything was already crystal clear. His opponent understood that all the words had been chosen perfectly, so he sat down on the floor and bowed his head. Tadano-kun thought to himself that he himself knew what he was running away from. The fact that his strength had not grown much since high school. He bullied the weak to vent his anger. But then he was saved by Kusanagi, who used to be weak, and the guy couldn't accept this reality. While our hero was fighting another batch of monsters, the former academy student blamed himself for his own weakness. But Kusagami Minato had no time to think about that because he had a global task ahead of him that had to be accomplished. The teenager concentrated on his current opponents, realizing that the lives of other people depended on it. It seemed that it was no trouble at all for our hero to defeat all these monsters. The boy used all the techniques he knew, although he was only using a small fraction of his abilities. A few minutes later, Minato Kusanagi was carefully examining the results of his abilities. He thought to himself that the number of guards had increased, and at this rate, the boss would not be far away. Turning to the students sitting on the floor, the student told them to relax because there was no longer any threat. With some irritation in his voice, Katsuragi Ryuji noted that the little one had taken everything and dumped it on his shoulders, and so he had to fight alone against the number of monsters that had fallen to him. The young man saw the monsters approaching the student, and she had to be saved. Using his skills, the guy shouted that he would do everything possible to resolve the situation. He immediately declared that he would protect everyone who needed help, adding that everyone should forget about panic and just follow him. The happy kids were surprised by everything that was happening, but what pleased them most was that someone cared about them. However, in the next second, clutching his head, Katsuragi Ryuji realized that there were too many entities approaching him, and he would not be able to defeat them on his own. At that moment, Minato Kusanagi appeared and asked if he needed help, which frightened his colleague. He asked the young man not to appear so unexpectedly. Looking at the monsters, the young man says that first, he needs to deal with all these monsters, and only then do something. But his partner declared with horror that they couldn't cope with such an invasion on their own, and therefore it would be best to look for another way to escape. Our hero was not accustomed to standing around and thinking, so in a moment he began to exterminate all these creatures one by one. Despite the fact that they had been almost completely destroyed, the young man had no intention of releasing the magic circle. The third-year student, who had recently thought that nothing would work, now did not understand how this teenager had managed to do such a thing. Realizing that the way was clear, the young man shouted to all the students that they were now free to move around. The students didn't waste any time, realizing that monsters were no joke, and immediately rushed to the academy's exit. But what surprised the students even more was that Minato Kusanagi had put up some kind of protection to make the students' journey as safe as possible. As for Katsuragi Ryuji, he was genuinely impressed by what the teenager had done. He understood that it was an incredible feat that he couldn't help but be proud of. Realizing that everyone had left, the young man pondered what to do next. He considered returning to the building to check everything thoroughly once more. The teacher watched the students closely as they fought off another group of beasts, telling them to keep their formation and not give up. Mizuha Yuika, who was also among these students, understood that this was not as easy as she would have liked. But at that moment, her sister approached her from behind and gently hugged her shoulders. She said that if she couldn't fight, it would be better to go into hiding so as not to be a burden. But turning her head sharply, our hero's ward proudly declared that she would fight after all, because there was no time to rest now, and there could not be. Mizuha Ruka said nothing. She just watched as her relative returned to the fray and reactivated her defenses. At that moment, Katsuragi Ryuji reported to the teacher that he had brought the rescued people. The girls wanted to know about the overall situation, and the young man immediately said that it was critical. Mizuha Yuika was most concerned about her acquaintance, so she asked what was happening to him. The third-year student happily announced that the young man was in no danger, that he was very strong, and that this was just a warm-up for him. The beauty smiled, relieved to hear that this was indeed the case. After that, the guy noted that Kusanagi was a really cool person, and perhaps with his help, overcoming the disaster would not be as difficult as one might think. Our hero's protege proudly declared that she felt the same way because she believed in him. Suddenly, all the students stopped, looked around, and began to back away, asking what it was. The teacher did not bother to investigate further. He simply stated that the students needed to get to their shelters as soon as possible. But a moment later, a huge monster appeared before the assembled crowd, snarling and growling. Now, even Katsuragi Ryuji understood that there were too many enemies, and therefore it was necessary to hide as quickly as possible. It seemed that the monsters were not going to give up, and so they quickly caught up with the students who were trying to reach the gym. Our heroes ran as fast as they could, knowing that they would definitely not be able to fight these beasts. However, for some reason, Yui suddenly turned around and paused. She realized that right behind them was a huge monster that was about to attack them. Unexpectedly, help arrived in the form of a police squad that was going to seriously deal with the problem. The young man shouted that they would immediately begin exterminating the monsters because the safety of the civilian population was paramount. The students, who had been waiting so long for this, shouted with relief that the police had arrived, so the situation could be considered resolved. Shido Shigo said that now that they had arrived, everyone could relax, and then told those present to evacuate immediately. Hearing Yui say that they would fight, the law enforcement officers said that it wasn't worth it, but they heard the girls rebuke that they weren't ordinary residents, and therefore had the right to be there. Mizuha Ruka was standing behind them and heard the conversation. She added to what her sister had said, saying that magicians were capable of many things. Realizing that arguing was pointless, the police officer agreed to let the girls help, but said that they could only attack from the rear. He thought to himself that there were actually very few people in the police force who could stand up to monsters. At that moment, Sanada Karin rushed to one of the students and was already healing her leg, saying that she would be able to return to duty very soon. Looking out the window, Minato Kusagani decided that since the police had arrived, he could leave some of the work to them, realizing that he was already trying to cover almost the entire territory. However, the reality was that the police arrived before the self-defense forces, and this was a national disaster, so there was no reason for the state not to have prepared measures for such an event. And then he decided that anything was possible in this country, because here the world was literally reaching the point of insanity. Running away, the guy said aloud that no matter what, he had to do what he had to do, and he couldn't vouch for anyone else. Suddenly, reporters shouted that, according to information, the police had arrived at the scene, but the number of monsters was only increasing, and therefore, it was unclear whether there would be enough people and forces. She immediately added that ordinary citizens were awaiting the arrival of the magical aristocracy. The ordinary people watching this report understood that they wanted not only to hear about this aristocracy, but also to see it in action. Older people noted that they pay taxes to the treasury, so the most powerful magicians simply must come to their aid, and all that remains is to wait. The media representative, as if sensing the tension among the people, said herself that the aristocracy should arrive as soon as possible, because without them it would be difficult. At that moment, Fukujin, who was an aristocrat, told his assistant to leave him alone. He immediately declared that the police could handle a small-scale disaster, and that the aristocracy's help was not needed. The man wanted to argue, but didn't know what to say, so he asked where his master was going. Without even turning around, he said indifferently that he was going to bed. Bowing, but only after the door had closed, the elderly assistant simply wished his master a good night. The police did everything they could, but after a while, assessing the situation realistically, they realized that things were getting even worse. Asking his colleague if they could clear the monsters from the entrance area, the guy said that it was simply impossible because there were so many monsters. Shido Shigo thought to himself that the monsters were appearing faster than expected, and that there was no way to evacuate the citizens. The self-defense forces were limited to logistical support, and were not yet ready for action. The only hope was the magical aristocracy, but there was no contact with them. And then he shouted out loud that this was the kind of magical aristocracy they had in their time, and that they were useless. The students who had not left also put up a strong resistance against the predators, doing everything in their power, realizing that they could only count on themselves. And again, the policeman thought that he knew the information. But the real disaster was even worse, and people had resisted it many decades ago. He was frightened by what would happen when the boss appeared before them, who was more powerful than all these small creatures put together. At that moment, the students saw some kind of predator that looked quite terrifying. Everyone understood that they were facing a high-ranking beast, but they still believed in something better. However, none of those gathered could utter a word. It seemed that everyone was paralyzed by all-consuming fear. With a trembling voice, the policeman, who understood that there was no point in entertaining false hopes, said that this was indeed the demon boss. This monster was rarely encountered in the modern world, and only the magical aristocracy could defeat it. It required magic of the 5th rank or higher, and there was no one present who even came close to that level of power. It seemed that this monster was well aware of its power and superiority, and therefore felt at ease in the world. Mizuha Yuika did not know what to do or where to run, so she stood there in surprise and continued to watch what was happening. Suddenly her sister, who was standing nearby, tried to use her magic. It was somewhat reckless, but considering that the aristocracy had not arrived and the police forces were running out, something had to be done. But suddenly, Ruka sensed that the monster had understood the plan and was not going to just stand there and watch. All she managed to do was shield her sister with her body. A second later, the enemy struck, and everyone present saw a bright flame, but there was nothing they could do about it. The surprised younger sister seemed unable to comprehend how this could have happened, and stood rooted to the spot. Our hero's ward looked intently at Ruka and didn't know how to help her in this situation. Falling to the ground, she only told the girl to run and save herself. However, the student watched closely, not realizing the full situation until the very end. Hugging her sister, the unfortunate girl looked up at the sky and hoped that someone would come and save them. The police understood that they did not have enough strength. There were wounded people among the children whom no one could evacuate, so they also shouted and asked for help. Katsuragi Ryuji did the same, even though he himself did not understand who could steer the situation in the right direction. Suddenly, the boss began to use a flaming column, a powerful stream of fire that belonged to the 5th rank, and after that, the police realized that they could not oppose it. Hugging her sister, our hero's ward called out to him again and again, hoping that at least he could do something. With each passing minute, despair overwhelmed the student, so she cried and screamed louder and louder. The boss, who was standing engulfed in flames, did not hear any of this. He dreamed of wiping the city off the face of the earth. A slight smirk played on his face, but he was in no hurry to attack openly. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, Minato Kusanagi appeared, and apologetically said that he couldn't come earlier, so he was sorry about that. He then noted that he had of course kept everyone waiting, but it had not been in vain. It seemed that Mizuha Yuika hadn't heard any of these words. She looked at her sister and continued to cry. Looking at the girl, the young man said softly that Ruka was fine. She had just lost consciousness, but would soon come to. The young man knew that now was not the time to focus on this problem, but on a more serious one. But our hero did not want to rush, because he was aware of the condition his friend was in. There were plenty of wounded guys, all lying nearby, but that wasn't dangerous. The most important thing was to fight the boss. Getting up, Minato Kusagani looked carefully in front of him, his face showing tension. At the same time, the guy's stance showed determination. It seemed that nothing could stop him from doing what he had planned. Hearing the girl call his name, the young man said calmly that he could do it, that he would defeat this boss. Looking at the teenager, the beauty just nodded slightly, signaling that she believed in him. Before leaving, our hero did something incredible, causing the whole earth to sparkle with a white healing light. Surprised, Yuka, who had never seen anything like this before, asked excitedly what it all meant, but in a moment she noticed that the wounds had suddenly begun to heal. Not only on her sister, but on everyone else as well. With each passing minute, the light became brighter and softer, and it was the greatest miracle. The students, even those who were in serious condition, began to look closely at their wounded limbs and rejoice that everything was over. But the policewoman was most amazed. She understood that this was 3rd rank holy magic, the sacred 5th, and it was something even she did not possess. Running up to her colleague, the girl asked how he was feeling, and he only replied that the magical power was almost gone. But then something unusual happened. Sanada Karan immediately tried to understand what was happening and wanted to ask her partner the same question. But he said in a tired voice that he didn't have time to think about it all. He only knew that he had to save people urgently. Realizing that the young man's strength was running out, the policewoman began to scold him for such recklessness, but he refused to listen, explaining that they had to fight to the end. At the same time, the law enforcement officer thought to herself that it was pointless because it was all over. Looking around, she declared that the entire police force had been destroyed and that they couldn't cope on their own. The guy saw it himself and said that they had been waiting for help, but neither the army, nor the self-defense forces, nor the magical aristocrats would come. Ordinary people were left alone with an army of terrible beasts, and even worse, their boss was there, whom no one could defeat. The journalists who were there reported with horror that this must be some kind of mistake, because the police were completely defeated. The guys, who continued to watch what was happening, cried out in despair that there was no help from the magical aristocracy, who did not deem it necessary to come. There was no one who could fight, no one who could defeat the highest-ranking demon. Amidst this chaos, only Minato Kusanagi remained calm and devoted to his cause. The police officers saw the teenager heading towards the monsters and shouted in unison for him to turn back, because the demon would kill him with a single glance. However, our hero did not listen to them and was not going to listen, because he saw his goal right in front of him. In a cold tone, the boy addressed the boss and told him that he had been acting too arbitrarily. But the demon did not think to respond. He watched his opponent closely. The guys sitting not far away heard the whole conversation. They clearly heard the boss say that he would kill Kusanagi Minato. The police officers understood that they had done everything they could, but in a situation involving a demon, they were powerless. A moment later, the ill-wisher directed a huge stream of mana toward the young man, but he only told the boss to shut up because he had no business with him. Wanting to instill fear, he yelled at the top of his lungs, thinking he was almighty and invincible. Our hero thought to himself that he had taken it seriously during the global catastrophe, but now he needed to be calmer so as not to frighten those around him. And then the young man decisively directed a powerful stream of energy toward the enemy. The police officers who were watching all this thought that the student had been killed. The guys who were standing not very close but could clearly see what was happening thought so too. However, Minato Kusagani gathered as much energy as possible and created several discs, which he intended to use to attack and defend himself. And so, within a minute, powerful and bright energy threads began to emanate from these discs, and they were much more powerful than the ones he had used when the boys were training. And if before that the law enforcement officers were surprised because they thought the student had been killed, now they didn't understand who he was. This was also noted by the media, who pointed out that the young man's face was not visible, but that he was definitely a student of the academy. But they couldn't do that because a powerful stream of fire burst forth with renewed force. Mizuha Yuika, who was already spinning her magic disc, thought she had calmed down and could fight again. But while the girl was preparing to use her power, her mentor did something so amazing that it was beyond imagination. The other students were now rooting for their classmate, hoping that he would defeat everyone and save them. But at that very moment, the young people were surrounded by low-level monsters which were still abundant in the area. The students wanted to do something, but they didn't have time, because they only noticed how the monsters seemed to disappear in an instant. As he got up, the policeman told his colleague that there was still work to be done, so they had to do what they could. Turning his head, Minato Kusanagi noted with satisfaction that the modern police were not doing so badly at their job. However, there was no time to be distracted, so the young man continued to accumulate mana and direct it at the villain. It was clear that the villain didn't like it, but he wasn't going to give up so easily. Therefore, he began to use magic discs to inflict more damage, but also to protect himself. At that moment, Shido Shego said with horror that they were witnessing 6th rank magic, which meant that aristocratic level magic was being used, against which they were powerless. And the power of the fire was indeed such that it could burn not only the entire city, but half the country in a second. Everyone nearby watched in horror, realizing that this was something unimaginable. The students felt that no one could save them, because there were only a few magicians of this level, but none of them came to their aid. The teacher stepped forward a little, wanting to do something for his students, even though he knew he was too weak for such a task. The students understood that their teacher was too weak to fight this monster, so they just watched everything and waited for the outcome. The policewoman, hugging one of the students, hoped silently that this boss would be destroyed. However, her colleague was not so convinced about Kusanagi Minato, because he understood that no matter how strong the teenager was, he would not be able to defeat this demon. Only Mizuha Yuika believed with certainty that her friend would be able to win. There was simply no other option. The girl had seen what this young man was capable of, and therefore knew that his power was practically limitless. At that moment, the boy was thinking that the demon was huge but slow, and that it had acted foolishly by using the 6th rank. But meanwhile, the young man was happy, realizing that he would not be able to fight with the 2nd rank, which, although lower, was more difficult to execute. Beginning his mesmerizing magical manipulations, Kusanagi Minato lamented a little that he did not want to draw attention to himself. Looking at all this enchantment, Shido Shigo noted that it all resembled a giant water snake, but the essence was different, namely that it was already a synthesis of magic. And in a moment, a snake's head appeared, which was actually a huge stream of water. The boss saw how our hero not only easily absorbed his power, but also gave a powerful rebuff with the help of synthesis, although shouted that he would destroy not only the boy, but all people. But the student was not going to give up. He understood what he was capable of, and therefore concentrated more and more on the result with every passing second. Finally, our hero looked closely at the results of his work, realizing that he could relax a little. He thought to himself that this terrifying monster had no self-control. The young man thought the battle would take much longer, but it turned out that the beast was weaker than expected. A few more minutes passed, and everyone noticed that a bright beam of light illuminated not only the academy, but the entire city. Smiling, the guy happily thought that after defeating the boss, the disaster had passed, and therefore they could relax for a while. The students, who were still sitting on the ground, couldn't believe that they were no longer in danger. But they were even more amazed that the boss had been defeated by an ordinary student. Suddenly, the students began to shout and rejoice, sharing their emotions. The media representatives did the same, who, not seeing any representatives of the aristocracy, already thought that this was the end for them. The policewoman also had tears in her eyes, noting that now everything was definitely fine. Shido Shigo, who was standing nearby, couldn't believe that a student had dealt with the demon. The young man realized that even if the aristocracy had been there, they would hardly have done anything useful. But a moment later, the policeman sat down on the ground again, saying aloud that his legs were not holding him up very well due to the shock he had experienced. Approaching Yuika, the young man noted that he had finished the battle, hearing that the girl had never doubted him. After that, folding her arms across her chest, the beauty began to thank her savior for his help. The young man, looking intently at his acquaintance, said that he was happy to try and help when he could. Suddenly, our hero noticed that a whole crowd of guys was approaching him. They all rushed to compliment him, saying that the young man was not only cool, but also fearless. Moreover, the students couldn't believe that one of them had defeated the boss. Sitting in the classroom, his classmates watched the video, continuing to note that now no one could match Kusanagi Minato in strength, that he was incredible, and immediately continued to compare whether the guy had heard that he had been transferred to Class S. Approaching from behind, the girls made remarks to the young men, saying that they were disturbing the hero and adding that they should not be talking at all. Our hero hoped that his classmates had done all this out of noble motives, but they immediately began to ask their own questions, which were even more tiresome. Only the bespectacled boy sitting by the window sarcastically remarked that Minato Kusagani had become conceited, but it was impossible for an ordinary student to possess such power. And while the guys were distracted by this boy, wanting to prove something to him, our hero took advantage of the opportunity and slipped out of the classroom. Standing in the hallway, the teenager thought about how nice it was to be in silence, when no one was commenting on anything. Turning to her friend, Mizuha Yuika jokingly said that she thought someone had a problem, but then heard the boy ask her not to make fun of him. But then she immediately said that the guy was a hero who protected everyone, and there was nothing she could do about it. Wanting to change the subject a little, Minato Kusanagi asked if it was true that his classmate had also been transferred to Class S. The girl explained that it was all because of her performance in the fight and her participation in the disaster. When asked if she was happy, she said she was and remembered someone else. After that, Yuika said that her sister was doing well and that they were now communicating much more often than before. The student was really happy that they had managed to get closer and even understand each other to some extent. A moment later, the student smiled again and thanked her friend for being there for her during a difficult time. But instead of understanding, the young man gave the girl a slap and did so with absolute calm. Mizuha Yuika didn't understand what she had done wrong, but the guy said that once was enough to show his gratitude, and so there was no need to praise him constantly. The girl wanted to argue, but she realized that her mentor was absolutely right, and that there was no reason to be offended. At that very moment, officials were holding a closed meeting, so the atmosphere was tense. The men discussed the issue of assistance in the event of a future disaster, if it were to happen again, and understood that other states were already overburdened. But what interested the attendees most was not this, but the rumor that the boss had been defeated by an ordinary student. As for the police, almost all of them had been defeated. Although they understood that there was no point in trying to figure this out, it would be best to hold a conference on a possible disaster, so that they would be prepared for it this time. A few minutes later, our heroes met on the street with the guys who had recently been their enemies. Ruka looked at the guys intently, but despite this, she was sad and silent. Mizuha Yuika and Kusanagi also stood and watched, not knowing what to say. Suddenly, our hero's ward's sister spoke up, saying that she had one request for the young man and wanted him to fulfill it. In a more abrupt and decisive tone, she stated that she wanted the young man to take her as his student. However, this conversation did not happen out of the blue. There were preconditions for it that had occurred a few days earlier. The two sisters sat together on a bench, wanting to talk about something, but neither of them knew how to begin. Finally, Ruka began to speak in an icy tone about the catastrophe that had unfolded. The girl suggested that the boss had defeated Kusagani, but Yuika firmly stated that this was indeed the case, and that it was because he had used 4th-rank magic synthesis. Hearing this, the student said that even a high-ranking mage couldn't use that kind of magic, let alone an ordinary student. But the younger sister calmly replied that it was not fiction, but the truth, even if it was hard to believe. Suddenly, the girl smiled and said that she believed it because her sister simply couldn't lie. She immediately added that she was convinced of her sister's honesty because Yuika had always been sincere, kind, and willing to help others. After that, she said she thought her sister shouldn't be a magician without talent, but it seemed that her approach was too harsh. Yuika was silent and looked intently ahead because she didn't know how to respond. Then, jumping up, she declared that she could become even stronger, much stronger, so that no one would have to worry about her. And then she shouted even louder that the girl didn't need to worry about her, she just needed to calm down. Her sister listened attentively, but now she didn't know how to react. Closing her eyes, she declared that Yuika was already an adult, which meant she could stand up for herself. For the first time in a long time, there was no misunderstanding between the sisters. It seemed that they finally understood each other. At that moment, Ruka thought to herself that Kusanagi Minato's real power was certainly not at the level of a schoolboy. He was probably even stronger than her father, and even stronger than most of the aristocrats. It was for this reason that the girl turned to her sister and asked if she could ask her for one thing. Standing in the middle of the courtyard, the beauty thought again. She understood that given the current situation, she could be considered an advanced mage at best, and therefore she needed the help of a stronger mage. Returning to the present, Ruka apologized to our hero for insulting him, and even looking down on him, adding that she was truly sorry. She immediately said that she understood perfectly well that this request was selfish. But no matter what, she had decided to ask for it anyway. Bowing her head, the girl said once again that she really wanted to study. Unexpectedly, Minato Kusagani calmly stated that he would take on the student as his pupil, but then immediately fell silent. The girl couldn't believe her ears. She was sure that the teenager would refuse, so she asked him why he had decided to do it, and heard that he had been asked to do so, and had agreed. He immediately added that the student had apologized, he had decided to forgive her. She had asked him to accept her request, and he had accepted it. There was no secret about it. Ruka just looked at the young man in surprise, but didn't know what else to say. At that moment, Katsuragi Ryuji approached from behind and also said that he had a request, and it was similar. Our hero replied that it didn't matter to him whether he had 1 or 2 students. Mizuha Yuika beamed with happiness, knowing that her new acquaintance was an amazing person. This was also said by the 3rd-year student, who had already hugged his mentor and started telling him some stories. The next day, Minato Kusanagi and his acquaintance were sitting in one of the academy's offices, where a press conference was being held. Opposite them sat the police officers who had bravely fought the monsters, but now they had questions they wanted answered. Bowing, the young people said that they would like to start by expressing their gratitude on behalf of themselves, the entire police force, and the ordinary citizens who also knew who had saved them. The young man calmly said that law enforcement officials had already expressed their gratitude many times during the interrogation, but that was enough, and he wanted to know why they had come. After that, the police explained that they had completed their investigation into the recent accident, but there were still a few points of interest. Shido Shego asked our hero if it was true that his abilities had awakened after the car accident, and immediately noted that there was no doubt about it, as many people had testified to this. But there is still a lack of understanding about how the accident changed the guy, who not only has no problems with magic, but also with communication. For a while, Minato Kusanagi sat silently, carefully considering how best to answer this question. The police officer added that everyone had noticed a change in his character, and that his magical abilities had become simply incredible. And that would be fine, but where did this amazing power come from, which allowed him to defeat even a demon? Suddenly, Mizuha Yuka interrupted the conversation, asking how this was relevant to the case. After thinking for a moment, the young man decided that he needed to rephrase the question so that everyone would understand. A moment later, the law enforcement officer asked the young man if he knew the magician in black. Hearing this, the guys were surprised. It seemed that they really didn't know who he was talking about. Showing the video, Shido Shego said that this was a magician who hid in the night, killed monsters, and helped people when they were in trouble. The video instantly went viral on the internet. Our hero looked closely at the police officers, now understanding what they meant. The student spoke again, repeating her question, and then said that there was a resemblance, but that wasn't a crime. The blonde man, convinced that this magician was the young man sitting in front of him, added that the resemblance was incredible. Apparently, the magician in black was a master. Few were capable of such feats at such a young age, and the date he began his activities was close to the date the young man was discharged from the hospital. And, looking at the teacher, he said that using magic on the streets without permission or qualification is illegal. But as a student of the academy, the young man has a certain freedom of action at the discretion of the academy. But in the case of such widespread publicity, the police have no choice but to act, and expulsion from the educational institution will not be the only consequence. But if the student confesses, law enforcement officials will do everything possible to mitigate the punishment, so the young man must respond with caution. After that, the young man looked closely at the people sitting opposite him. Kusanagi Minato understood that he was not going to reveal himself, so he calmly explained that it was not him. The blonde immediately began to laugh demonstratively, noting that he understood everything. As they left, the police officers apologized for the inconvenience, but said it was time for them to go. Walking down the corridor, the young man thought that the guy had no doubts. If the young man was that magician, then he couldn't take away his courage. It was hard to believe that a high school student was capable of such a thing. The policewoman had the same opinion. She was sure that Kusanagi was the magician in black, and the voice and atmosphere around him were similar. His nighttime activity had a purpose. Sanada Karin understood that she couldn't tell her boss about the teenager's true identity because she could be fired. But if this guy sacrificed himself for everyone, he was a good person. However, Shido Shigo had his own thoughts on the matter, and he decided to find out who this student really was at all costs. At the same time, the girl decided that she had to hide the young man's origins and his true abilities. The next day, the teacher called our heroes to the blackboard and introduced them. The woman said that from that day on, they would be studying in Class S, and therefore asked everyone to be friendly. But there was no need to say that, because the guys immediately surrounded Minato Kusanagi and began to ask him with interest how he had defeated the demon. As for the girls, they liked Yuika, who was part of an aristocratic family, and therefore wanted to know more about it. The teacher, who hoped that the students would be treated well, but not so well that it would disrupt the lesson, asked everyone to take their seats immediately. A short time later, walking down the hallway, our hero thought sadly about how he had been literally bombarded with questions, which was why he wanted to keep to himself. However, someone's voice suddenly pulled the young man out of his thoughts. Standing before them was the girl he had saved not only in the alley, but also during the battle with the monsters. Standing on the roof, Minato Kusanagi thought that he had been summoned to this place again. Perhaps because there was some kind of custom, so they called him here when there was something to do. At that moment, Mizuha Yuika was standing behind the wall, realizing that she wanted to train alone, so she came here. But she didn't think anyone would be here. Moreover, the girl's acquaintance was with some stranger, so she wanted to know what they were talking about. The stranger looked closely at Kusanagi and asked him if he remembered her, but he said he didn't remember anything like that. Upon hearing that he had saved the student during the disaster, the young man said that he now understood who she was talking about. After that, the student timidly said that she had also been saved by a mage during a battle lesson, asking if it was true that the mage was a young man. For a moment, the teenager thought, seemingly unsure of how best to proceed in this case. And then the beauty began to thank him again for saving her. Although the guy, as usual, said that it was unnecessary because he had only done what he could. Bowing her head and looking embarrassed, the student noted that the young man was actually doing cool and incredible things. Still standing behind the wall, Yuika thought with annoyance that she couldn't hear what the guys were talking about, even though she wanted to so badly. A moment later, the student confessed to our hero that she liked him and asked him out on a date. Yuika thought to herself in surprise that this girl had decided to openly express her true feelings. However, the young man just stared at one spot in surprise but remained silent. The beauty began to say that she had no special qualities, but she would do everything possible to make it interesting for them to be together. The young man stood motionless, as before, listening to the stranger's declaration that she wanted to be his girlfriend. After a moment, the guy began to smile, saying that he was grateful to the student for her feelings for him. After that, silence reigned, each thinking about something of their own, and no one dared to break it. Suddenly, the beauty heard the young man begin to apologize to her. He honestly admitted that he couldn't start a relationship because he had things to do. Lowering her head, the girl muttered something under her breath in an apologetic tone. Then she proudly declared that she was glad the guy had given her a clear answer, and added that she thought she could live with it. Unexpectedly, the student walked away, and our hero just stood and watched her go. When the stranger disappeared, Minato Kusagani told his ward that it was probably time to come out of hiding, which greatly confused the girl. Hearing Yui say that she had neutralized her magic, the teenager said that her magical power was so poorly coordinated that it was obvious. After that, the guy started teasing his friend for liking to spy on people, but she immediately began to justify herself, saying that it was completely accidental. In order not to prolong the conversation, the student began to ask why the young man rejected the student, since she seemed quite nice. Turning away, Minato Kusagani stated that he was not going to start any kind of relationship with anyone. And then he immediately thought that the age difference was too great, even though physically they were the same age. For a moment, the girl thought about what her acquaintance had just told her, but she didn't say anything out loud. Moreover, the beauty caught herself thinking that after hearing this, for some reason, it became easier for her to breathe. Realizing that it was too late to exercise, Mizuha Yuika began to descend the stairs, following her friend. For a moment, our hero paused, as if he wanted to turn back, although he was in no hurry to do so. This movement was noticed by the girl, who was a few meters away from the young man. Unexpectedly, Minato Kusanagi told his protege to try to regulate her magical power. Otherwise, her training would not be sufficient. Closing her eyes briskly, the girl proudly said that she knew that herself. She thought to herself that, as promised, she would try to become stronger, as much as necessary for the boy to recognize her. In the evening, going out hunting, the teenager thought about how the disaster was over. But despite this, the number of monsters had not decreased, and therefore he was worried that this could be a sign of a new one. At that moment, in one part of the district, a woman's voice begged for help, while at the same time some ill-wishers said that no one was ever here at this hour. Suddenly, kneeling down in front of the villain, the young man declared that the offender was mistaken, because even at this late hour, there was someone who could always come to the rescue. The ill-wisher couldn't believe it, and asked where the guy had come from. But the young man was not going to answer. He knew that he needed to deal with this problem as quickly as possible. Kusanagi Minato quickly summoned a magic circle to help him, although he did not particularly want to harm this stranger. Lying on the ground, he thought about how he had personally encountered an outlaw amateur mage, and he could honestly admit that he was certainly not bad in close combat. At that moment, the girl thanked Kusagami Minato, asking if it was true that he was the wizard in black that everyone talked so much about. Realizing that it was dangerous to stay in one place for too long, the young man immediately left, hearing the stranger ask not to rush so much. As he ran away, the young man realized that everyone was talking about him, but he didn't understand how he had become so popular. The next day, sitting on the roof, Minato Kusagani asked the guys who the magician in black was, pretending he knew nothing about him. The young man stated that, as far as he knew, an outlaw mage was someone who operated at night, and the students were gossiping about him. But it was unclear what was so unusual about this person. Hearing this, Katsuragi Ryuji explained that this guy had caused a stir because there were many videos of him on the internet. Suddenly, our hero began to ask what the internet was, realizing that he didn't know what the others were talking about. At that moment, the sisters began whispering that they suspected the teenager was unfamiliar with technology, but to such an extent that it was quite suspicious. The students did not want to laugh at their mentor, so they tried to explain to him in simple terms what it was, adding that everything spreads quite quickly on the internet. A minute later, the students began to say that you can watch a lot of things on a smartphone, and added that to do so, you first need to open the app. A moment later, the guy shouted as loud as he could, saying that his browser had opened. It sounded rather strange, but the students were pleased that they had been able to assist, and our protagonist happily announced that he would now be using the internet. Sitting on a bench, Mizu Haruka noted that the young man had promised to take them to training, but they still hadn't had a single lesson, although she would like to start already. Kusanagi Minato happily announced that they could start after class, and if they taught him how to use the internet, he would teach them everything they wanted to know. Looking ahead, Mizuha Yuika somehow thought to herself that she had a bad feeling about this, and she was right. After a couple of hours, the students were struggling to sit on the ground, trying to catch their breath. But their mentor calmly told them not to pretend they were tired, because this was only the beginning, and added that they should act as if they were on the verge of death. Katsuragi Ryuji, struggling to get up, declared that he should not be underestimated, because he would gladly show what he was really capable of. Our hero smiled, noting that this was exactly the attitude he liked, and therefore told the students that they had to show something else. Gathering themselves, the guys immediately began to attack the young man who was standing opposite them and watching intently. Meanwhile, not everything was going well in the vicinity of the Tokyo TV tower. where two employees were standing and talking about how nothing foreshadowed trouble. Looking ahead in fear, the men asked what was going on, realizing that the situation was getting out of control. What was happening was that a whole group of monsters was getting closer and closer with every passing minute, destroying everything in their path. While the monsters were doing their thing, our heroes continued to train actively in the courtyard. Kusanagi Minato, looking at the students, asked with a hint of sadness in his voice if they were already at their limit. The guys understood that they wanted to catch the young man off guard, so they immediately jumped up from their seats to attack him again. The teenager was expecting something like this, so he immediately put up a powerful defense. Moreover, he decided to attack at the same time, realizing that this might happen. A moment later, the students realized this, and slaps flew at them, just as they had during the tournament. Realizing that there was a gap in her mentor's defense, Yuika immediately rushed in to attack, knowing that she had become stronger. Turning his head, the young man shouted loudly that it was just her imagination. The surprised beauty couldn't believe her eyes. She didn't understand how the young man could have dodged her, since she had managed to calculate all his moves. And then the slap that had hit her companions a couple of seconds ago now flew towards her head. While the students were trying to recover, Minato Kusagani loudly announced that he was calling a break. One of the girls immediately went to get some water, realizing that it was the only thing she wanted right now. The others began to wipe themselves off or just sat silently, realizing that they didn't want to say anything. Mizu Haruka suddenly asked if the young man was too strong, hinting that he had never seen anything like it before. Ruka picked up on this, saying that the teenager was so strong that even she, with her strength, could not compete with such enormous power. Yuika smiled and noted that it should have been clear to everyone long ago that their mentor's level was not at all that of a student, but that was precisely what attracted them. However, the next minute the girl fell silent, watching intently in front of her. After that, the beauty noted that Kusanagi Minato had a look on his face as if he had been through it all 1,000 times and was therefore tired of it all. Understanding the unspoken question, the guy explained that he had nearly died in a car accident, and when he woke up, he had gained power, the reason for which was unknown, so it was better to leave it at that. The guys thought that the near-death experience was the reason for his awakening, so there was nothing strange about it. At the same time, Yuika noted to herself that her two friends were too naive. It was clear that the young man had said this just to get rid of them, but in reality, the reason was much deeper. It seemed to the girl that the reason for such power lay in something much deeper, or even secret, which is why the young man was hiding it so carefully. Suddenly, the coach looked at his students, deciding that they were too naive to believe him. Walking down the street, Katsuragi Ryuji stretched with pleasure. Noting that the training had been very intense, he immediately said that he wanted to eat, but when he got home, he would still have to cook for his young children. Looking at the young man in surprise, our hero honestly said that you wouldn't think he was that kind of person at all. However, the young man did not understand what was so strange about this, so he asked Minato Kusagani if he really did not cook. Smiling, the young man admitted that he always makes himself ramen and added that the world has become very convenient now. Now the third-year student was amazed, noting that an unhealthy lifestyle would ruin the teenager. But the latter only said that the guy was not his father, so he couldn't say that. A moment later, grabbing our hero, he told him to come visit him, adding that he could eat some good food. However, Minato Kusagani was not offended. He thought that his student was an assertive guy, but there was nothing wrong with that. Standing in the middle of the living room, the hero was not very surprised by what was happening to him, because children were jumping on him from all sides. Standing with plates of food, the host apologized for this, explaining that he had to look after all these children. But in a moment, the young man solved the problem by placing the children in magic capsules, which upset Katsuragi Ryuji, who asked him not to use magic in the house. He immediately added that it was unheard of to use magic for fun, not hearing the children asking for something similar to be organized for them because they liked it so much. And taking pity on them, he added that he had no idea that the teenager would be so good with children, and that the little ones clearly liked him. For a moment, our hero was transported back 50 years, when everything around him was burning and many children were sitting on the ruins and crying. With longing in his voice, Minato Kusagani declared that children are the greatest treasure. Hearing this tone, the owner of the house asked the teenager not to talk like an old man, but heard the same reproach directed at himself. However, after a short while, the situation changed because Katsuragi Ryuji was going to continue cooking, while our hero read books to the children. A couple of minutes later, everyone was sitting at a small table and giving thanks for the food that was on it. After that, the kids quickly grabbed their chopsticks and began to enjoy their food. The guest did the same, but he was somewhat confused and felt awkward. However, after a second, having tasted the food, he said that he really did not expect it to be so delicious. And, smiling, he thought to himself that he hadn't eaten home-cooked food for many years, as there was no normal food available while the war was going on. The young man was curious about where the young man's parents were, and he explained that his father was gone. His mother had to work late, so he had a part-time job, and in his free time, he looked after his younger siblings and cooked meals. Continuing to eat, the mentor honestly admitted that the young man had plenty to do. Smiling, the host noted that of course it was not easy for him, but he did not complain, as always. Our hero knew this very well himself, so he simply said that he understood everything in this regard. Seeing the young man flexing his muscles, Minato Kusagani said that the more difficult it was, the more motivated he was to work even harder. A few hours later, the whole family, including our hero, had settled down on the mattress and were getting ready for bed. The owner of the house immediately began to apologize for the fact that, due to the whims of his brothers and sisters, the young man had to stay the night, although he was not worried about it. Closing his eyes, the young man thanked the teenager once again. Hearing him say that there was no need for thanks, Katsuragi Ryuji stated that it was not for him, but for Ruku. He immediately added that she had started to glow more than before, noting that this had most likely happened immediately after our hero's appearance. The guy decided to himself that this might be related to something romantic, but decided not to say it out loud. However, he decided to ask if the owner of the house liked this girl, although the latter calmly said that this was not the case. He added that they just didn't fit together, and of course they spent a lot of time together. But that was only natural. Hearing the last sentence, Minato Kusanagi decided that in this respect he was very similar to the guys. The next day, the young people walked together, but this time to the academy. The sisters stood in the alley and watched the guys, saying reproachfully that they were both late, which was unacceptable. But the young man immediately began to justify himself, saying that Kusagi couldn't get out of bed, although instead of understanding, the girls began to scold them for not training and just resting. The young man did not understand why they had to make an appointment to go to the academy together, but decided that it was not so important. However, the guys didn't get anywhere because at that moment, the police officers who were standing nearby approached the teenager. Sighing deeply, our hero said with some annoyance that he had to see these people again. Realizing that they were not very welcome, the girls said that they had an urgent matter they wanted to discuss. She immediately reported that monsters had invaded the area around Tokyo TV Tower, and since it was highly likely that this was related to the disaster, they had come to ask for his cooperation. The young man thought it might be some kind of trick, so he replied that he was just an ordinary student. But the police officers began to argue, noting that the young man was the one who had stopped the disaster single-handedly, and that he did not fit the mold of an ordinary student. To put it simply, the police forces themselves were unable to cope. The young people spoke openly about how law enforcement agencies could not do anything about it, no matter how hard they tried. After that, Shido Shego once again turned to Kusagi and noted that they really needed this. Realizing that the police couldn't handle the monsters on their own, Minato Kusagani said that since they were asking him, he couldn't refuse their request. Sadly, the guy thought that he would prefer not to stand out again, but he didn't want to tell these people about it. Immediately, the law enforcement officers noted that there would be a reward for completing this task, and as for his absence from the academy, they would talk to the director. The guys who were standing aside and heard everything shouted that they would not remain indifferent and therefore also wanted to help. They would cover their backs. Closing his eyes, the police officer said that he was grateful to the young people for their help, but that they could not help in this case. Hearing the students say that they were the best, Shido Shego explained that this was not a standard battle, but something much stronger and more powerful. He immediately added that the students' strength was hardly equal to that of Kusanagi, and therefore this was another important nuance. Hearing this, the students thought about it and fell silent, because they understood that their mentor was not just a level, but something incredible. Approaching the car, the policeman said that it would be better for the young people to go to class, and that the young man would go with them, because time was of the essence. However, unexpectedly, our hero called out to his charges, who looked at him intently. Winking, the teenager told them to catch up with him, hinting that they also had power within them. The students looked at Minato Kusagani in surprise, but did not respond. And in a moment, the group of friends headed for the academy, knowing that they had their own responsibilities to fulfill. Sometime later, a meeting was held at the Central Police Headquarters, where it was reported that about 100 demons had appeared in the vicinity of the Tokyo TV Tower. The chief said that in order to stop this invasion, they had turned to a student who had taken an active part in the recent disaster that had begun there for help. So that everyone could meet the young man, he was asked to stand up, which he did immediately. The police officers sitting at the meeting did not understand how such a boy could have been brought to them, although others knew that it was this man who had bravely fought the boss. Closing her eyes, Sanada Kareen was more worried than anyone else, thinking that no one would take the young man seriously. Suddenly, Shido Shigo approached the microphone and coughed to get everyone's attention. All conversation in the hall immediately stopped and turned toward where their colleague was standing. The young man explained that Minato Kusagani was a student who had stopped the disaster at the academy, and that he had personally seen the young man and his actions up close, and could say that he was a real pro. Pointing to the teenager, he added that this person had taken part in the disaster, the first in decades, and therefore his cooperation was considered extremely necessary. And while the police officer asked that Kusagami be treated as an employee, the detractors continued to say that they were dealing with a child, and that professionals should be handling such matters. The chief, realizing that the discussion was dragging on, rose from his seat and shouted that the young man was not one of them, but was doing the same thing, and therefore it was time to start exterminating the monsters. The police officers realized that there was nothing more to discuss, so they decided that it was necessary to get down to business. A couple of minutes later, Shido Shigo approached our hero and began to apologize for his colleague's actions, but he said that he understood everything. Hearing these wise words, the blonde man noted that although the teenager was young in age, he was also very mature and experienced. Suddenly frightened, the female colleague looked at the man and said that she was going to stop the other employees, but got scared. But Minato Kusagani just smiled and said that it was okay to forget about it because it didn't matter. Smiling, Sanada Karan said that the boy was not only talented, but also very kind. Sitting in the car, the boy wanted to know about the overall combat power, and learned that there would be a total of 80 mages, most of them mid-level, and only a few higher-level ones. Our hero thought to himself that, as far as he remembered, mid-level mages could use magic up to the 2nd rank, and those one level higher could use it up to the 3rd rank. The blonde man, understanding what the young man was thinking, said that it was a pity to admit, but the student was the only one who could use 4th rank magic synthesis, which meant that he was the strongest of them all. As for tactics, there were none, really. Everyone would see the outcome of the battle, which took place in open terrain using only magic. The teacher thought that there would be no problems with magical creatures and guards. But the intelligence of creatures such as demons and other beings is stronger, and therefore countermeasures are necessary, and therefore a head-on battle cannot be called a strategy. Responding to the guy's question about weapons, the policeman explained that there are no weapons that can be effective against such monsters, and many fight only in clothing or costumes that are convenient for movement. Kusanagi remembered that such weapons used to exist, but the blonde man explained that now only the aristocracy has a few, and even then in small quantities. Lowering his head, our hero decided that this simply couldn't be true, because there used to be so many weapons, but now only the lowest level mages remained. Shido Shigo watched the guy closely in the rearview mirror, but decided to keep quiet for a while. After a while, the whole team approached their destination, which was visible from afar. The police were waiting, so everyone was ready for the battle to begin soon. Looking at the monsters, the guy thought that the disaster itself had not yet begun, but the number of creatures was unusual. For this reason, the young man did not understand what was really going on. The police officers who had been looking askance at our hero in the courtroom were now indignant that there were many more beasts than had been indicated in the report. They immediately added that they could see demons they couldn't fight, so they should ask for help from civilians or the magical aristocracy. The blonde man explained that requests had been sent, but they were unlikely to receive any responses, as the number of monsters and outlaw mages was increasing throughout the country, and therefore everyone was now overwhelmed with work. Realizing that only those who had arrived at the scene would be fighting, the men shouted that it was suicide. Realizing that there were indeed many beasts, the event leader asked Kusagani if they could handle it. Sighing, the boy honestly said that they had to do it, as there was no other way out. The detractors suddenly shouted that the boy was useless anyway, that he was talking nonsense, and that in fact there were too many monsters to defeat. The student did not argue with them, he just quietly said that something had changed. After that, everyone looked closely at the monsters, who were growling and staring at the sky. The police officers did the same automatically, noticing that the sky was turning red again, which foreshadowed disaster. At that moment, the radio reported that the disaster was gaining momentum again across the country. Realizing that the situation was now complicated not only at the tower, the dispatcher explained again that the disaster was gaining momentum across the country. The primary task was to rescue the townspeople, and therefore everyone was asked to take immediate measures to combat the disaster. In addition, priority was given to measures to combat the disaster in large cities, with no reinforcements available for other locations. The frightened police officers shouted again that a disaster had begun, but it was difficult for them to understand how such a thing could even be possible. Still staring intently at the sky, our hero thought that disasters always happen spontaneously, but in this case, everything looked as if the monsters had deliberately caused it. Although in 50 years, anything could have happened. Detractors, who had never liked it before, now said that without help, they would definitely not be able to do anything. But Minato Kusagani quietly noted that the work had begun. However, a second later, he asked if it was true that the monsters were moving towards the city, because it certainly looked that way. The police did not answer. They began to discuss the situation among themselves, saying that the most important thing now was to save the civilians, although in the current situation, it would be difficult to do so. One of the young men started shouting and getting angry again, saying that the police couldn't do anything and that no one would be able to cope with so many monsters. Without saying a word, the teenager jumped over the fence in one movement and headed straight for the monster's lair. After that, rushing down, the young man fearlessly declared that they would do everything as necessary. The young man saw the monsters looking at him intently, hoping for something, even though he knew it would not happen. In a moment, Kusanagi Minato landed on the ground, knowing what to do next. But if there had been several dozen monsters a moment ago, now there seemed to be up to 100. The police officers could see perfectly well what was happening, so they shouted at the teenager to leave immediately, because these monsters would not spare him. But the boy did not listen to anyone. He immediately began to use the wind cutter, a third-level manipulation that was very powerful. After that, those who had criticized the young man just a moment ago now watched him in amazement. Unable to believe that such a thing was possible, Shido Shigo had already seen something like this before. So he smiled, realizing that this student was actually capable of a lot. Only a minute had passed, and it had become quiet around our hero because he had managed to destroy most of his opponents. Despite the fact that some had been dealt with, another group was waiting ahead, which also promised trouble. They saw what was happening, so they immediately took up a defensive stance and opened fire on the guy. One might think that Kusanagi Minato would be frightened by something like this, but that was not the case. He stood and silently watched his defenses work automatically. The teenager thought to himself that he could easily defend himself without a magical barrier, but he had an audience, so it was better not to forget about this nuance for now, otherwise various questions would arise. Realizing that protection was good, but that it was also necessary to destroy evil, the young man immediately set about doing so. The blonde immediately began to think about how powerful the student was, but he was curious how many elements he was using since no one else had entered the battlefield, and then he suddenly shouted that he was also coming to help, to at least take some of the burden off the young man. The other police officers saw their colleagues rush into battle, but despite this, they stood rooted to the spot, not knowing what to do. However, in the next second, another officer clenched his fist and said that it was unheard of for professionals to run away, trembling with fear, and therefore declared that they must not fall behind this guy. The guys understood that they didn't have that kind of strength, but despite this, they did what they could. Distracted from the process, our hero watched the law enforcement officers fight, and happily noted to himself that they weren't as bad as they might seem. Suddenly, everyone gathered began shouting that there was a demon ahead, and that they should prepare themselves. The police immediately said with horror that their ranks were not enough to defeat this monster, unless you were a legendary mage. A cold, protective energy immediately began to gather around the demon, impossible to miss. The men immediately closed ranks and moved a little further away, realizing that its power was indeed great. Kusanagi Minato said at that moment that he would deal with this monster himself, while the others should finish off the rest so that they could clean up together. The frightened police officers asked in horror if the guy had really defeated them last time. They immediately added that he was actually a cool magician, seeing the results of the student's work. The blonde, who was the senior, ordered his assistants to destroy all the evil creatures, and if they noticed someone strong, they should send them to Kusunoki. He thought about how 50 years ago, a catastrophe had struck the entire world, and it was the first of many catastrophes that had occurred since then, throwing the world into chaos. If history repeated itself, horror would fill the entire world. However, this time our hero is here, although not in his previous incarnation, and therefore he will not allow humanity to be destroyed. At that moment, Sanada Karin, who had been helping the police officer, saw a huge ghost in front of her that she could not resist. But suddenly a teenager appeared and immediately put up a defense so that nothing would threaten the girl. The young man realized that he had managed to come to the rescue in time and destroy another demon. The delighted police officer remembered that it was the same kind of sudden help she had received that night in Shibuya. Approaching the unfortunate girl, the young man decided to ask if she was all right, hearing a grateful response. Kusanagi Minato also remembered that evening because the situation was similar, and therefore decided that the girl might recognize him. The policewoman wondered why this man was involved in black magic and why his student was so powerful. The girl wanted to ask about it, but she didn't know if he would listen to her or even talk to her in the future. Suddenly, the beautiful girl began to cry and scold herself for such thoughts, noting that he was just a student. But the tears quickly stopped because what the girl saw surprised her greatly. The young man began to repel the attack, which came from different sides, with renewed vigor. Stammering, the law enforcement officer wanted to say that it was all very dangerous, but then began to apologize, realizing that she was saying the wrong thing. The guy understood that this young woman needed help, so he told her not to leave him, thinking to himself that for some reason she couldn't use her combat magic. Still looking intently at Kusanagi Minato, the girl said she would do everything he told her to do. And again, she wondered if the teenager was really a student, or if it was all just some kind of joke. The reason was that this guy behaved more maturely than she did. The other police officers fighting the demons were doing so bravely, but it was clear that something was bothering them. Each of them said that they were trembling, and this prevented them not only from concentrating, but also from dispelling magic. And this was despite the fact that the main demon was raging ahead of them, a fight that had to be left for later. Suddenly, the blonde man, seeing it, shouted that it was not the demon itself, but a subspecies that was slightly stronger. Sitting down on the ground, the police officers declared that now everything was definitely lost, because they were not sure if they could win even if the magical aristocrats appeared here. Only Minato Kusagani stood and watched this subspecies closely, remaining silent. Seeing the young man step forward, the men began to tell him not to do it, not even to try, because he was no match for it. But the young man, with his characteristic positivity, calmly said that he would prevail. The police officers didn't know what else to say, so they just watched to see how events would unfold. A second later, one of the law enforcement officers looked at his hands and noticed that for some reason they had suddenly stopped shaking. The girl didn't know what to expect, so she closed her eyes and began to pray silently that Kusagani would bring them victory. The blonde man thought that he was sure that this student's power was equal to the level of the aristocrat's magic, and therefore this boy would be able to destroy not only the demon, but also its subspecies. Our hero didn't think about anything, he just watched the one he would have to fight. Despite this, everyone gathered wanted the young man to show them all his power. The squad leader knew that there was no time to waste on talking, so he ordered everyone to give it their all until the boss was defeated. But the boss made it clear that he didn't think anyone could hurt him. Perhaps that is why our hero froze for a moment and just stared ahead. He saw everything burning and flying around him and understood that a serious battle was unfolding, but he had his own goal. And that goal was now standing in front of him. A monster that had already begun to attack, although it had not yet used its magic to its full power. Even in this situation, the teenager did not rush to do anything. He simply waited to understand what he needed to be prepared for. It seemed that the power of the fire was growing stronger and stronger with every second, and could burn everything in its path. The police officers, who saw that the boy was unfazed by all this, now sincerely said that they had never seen anything like it, especially from a student. Kusanagi Minato, as before, stood in the middle of all this chaos and simply waited for the right moment to attack. A moment later, the monster asked his opponent what kind of creature he was. However, our hero calmly stated that he was just an ordinary student, and added that at the moment, he was simply a student. After that, the demon fell silent and now watched the guy, who was also doing nothing. But not much time passed before Kusanagi Minato decided it was time to put up his powerful defense, because the conversation was over. The boss immediately summoned a huge flame that should have easily burned the young man. Suddenly, the police officers shouted, unable to believe that they were facing a demon who wielded 6th rank power. But our hero wasn't thinking about that. He couldn't decide how best to prove himself in this situation, because his opponent's magic was actually too great. The problem was that the assistants who were supposed to protect the rear now did not understand where to run, because the monsters surrounded them from different sides. The young people realized that they could not resist such power, although they tried to do so. The blonde, who had never seen anything like this before, understood that somehow the monsters were coordinating with each other, although this had never happened before and was somewhat absurd. The policewoman, watching the events unfold, was most concerned for the teenager, so she tried to shout to him. Realizing that the student was standing his ground even though he was being attacked from all sides, the woman shouted even louder for him to leave and save himself, because he certainly couldn't defeat such a horde. Time passed, and Minato Kusanagi remained where he was, continuing to do so, watching everything around him closely. Finally, the young man put up one of his defenses, now watching as the hellish flames hit one of them. It was an incredible 6th rank action, and an explosive stream that was literally breathtaking. And despite this, the young man continued to stand as if it did not concern him at all. Something incredible was happening around him, with attacks coming from all sides, but the young man was tightly enveloped in a protective net. It seemed that the monster standing directly opposite him, staring intently at the young man, understood this too. In a calm tone, the teenager asked the boss if he thought this was the end. Shido Shigo, surprised by everything that was happening, tried to say something, but couldn't find the right words to describe what an incredible guy was standing in front of them. The other policewoman picked up on this as well, trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Scratching his head, the blonde man noted that this student's power was beyond all limits, and seemingly impossible things were happening right before their eyes. Only people of the magical aristocracy could use 6th rank magic, and remote activation was also a high-level technique. Hearing this, Sanada Karan tried to understand how this could be, but did not dare to say anything about it. The blonde guy noted that there was one more thing that surprised him. Something that seemed to indicate that the young man had also used another type of magic that he knew nothing about. Usually, magic can only be used once, and then you have to wait a few seconds to use it again. But this guy used magic again after just a moment. Magic is powerful in itself, and the fact that the teenager used it without delay suggests that this person is a superior aristocrat. He thought to himself that his intuition had not failed him, because this was exactly the young man the police officer was looking for. Standing before him was a second Minato Ichigami, and it didn't matter who this student was now. The monster was not going to give up so easily, so he growled, making it clear that he had enough strength to deal with the boy. For some reason, the monster said that there was very little space there, so it would be best to clear it. Our hero knew what that meant, so he began to use the 1st rank and some kind of aerobics. The opponent didn't like any of this, but he had to play by the rules that had already been set. Looking at the result, Minato Kusagani said quietly that it seemed he could use aerobics after all, although he had doubted it for a moment. The monster watched closely, not knowing what this could lead to. Finally, the monster understood what it was for, and therefore said that the guy's goal was to disrupt overall coordination. Although our hero stated in an indifferent tone that he didn't care about the monster's clumsy coordination. And with a smile, he added that here he would be able to resist, although he did not specify what he meant. The ill-wisher understood that he had to act, so he immediately began to attack his opponent. Thanks to his agility, the young man dodged very quickly, so that he did not even need to use magic. The guy knew his strengths, so he tried to use them to the maximum. At one point, it seemed that Kusanagi Minato had regrouped, although it was not very clear what he was going to do next. The monster didn't know either, so it just attacked, but it didn't use all its strength. For a moment, the teenager stopped and looked up somewhere. He knew he had used a trick, and it should have had an effect. Suddenly, everyone present noticed a powerful explosion that seemed to be visible from everywhere. Only the boy turned away from the fire and the monster behind him. After that, even stranger manipulations began, which seemed impossible or unreal to everyone present. The monster also understood that this was an unusual battle for him, since until that moment he had never encountered such strong guys as the young man. A moment later, it seemed as if our hero had hidden among the clouds, while the monster was in the very center, although it did not understand where its opponent was. The beast looked around carefully, but could not see anything, and therefore there was no point in attacking, since there was no target. At that moment, the young man was standing nearby, but it seemed as if he was hidden by some kind of veil. Finally, the ill-wisher understood everything, which is why he began to insult Minato Kusagani as much as possible. However, this did not matter to the teenager, who had already changed his position. After that, he said that the monster's prediction was not so bad if it understood that magic would be ineffective and chose hand-to-hand combat. But the villain, looking into the teenager's eyes, declared that the attempt had still been unsuccessful, even though he himself understood this. In the next moment, the opponents were face to face again, knowing that the battle was not over yet. The young man declared menacingly that he was not afraid of blows because they would not harm him anyway. And in a moment, the young man swung and struck the predator, knowing that he could do much more if he wanted to. Flying to the side, the monster said aloud that this had never happened before, that a human blow could damage him. Therefore, the boss knew that now was the time for him to do something to show what demons of his level were capable of. But realizing that nothing was working, the monster asked what the kid had done to him. And the kid replied innocently that before this fight, He thought he could only use magic, but it turned out he could also fight a little. Kusanagi Minato was glad that his little trick had worked, which meant that he was already a level above in something. He announced aloud that he would now show his opponent his own technique. It was clear that the young man was using something that few people knew about, including the monster, who was trying to figure out what was going on. The police officers were just as surprised as everyone else, and while the blonde man felt a chill, the girl felt as if something was descending from the sky. And indeed, everything around them suddenly changed and took on completely different colors. The most interesting thing was that it seemed as if Minato Kusagani knew exactly where this was all going. Suddenly the young man opened his eyes, which were now sky blue, and his face showed complete peace. Taking a defensive stance, the disciple was no longer afraid. If they suddenly decided to attack him,